Once upon a time, there was a young woman named Emily who loved hiking. She had been on many hikes in her life and always felt confident in her ability to navigate through the wilderness. But one day, she went on a hike in a new area, and things didn't go as planned. As she walked deeper into the forest, she realized that she had taken a wrong turn somewhere. She tried to retrace her steps, but it only seemed to make things worse. Before she knew it, the sun began to set, and darkness began to creep in. Emily felt a growing sense of panic as she tried to find her way back to the trailhead. She called out for help, but no one answered. She was truly lost. As the night progressed, Emily's fear only grew stronger. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made her jump. She tried to keep moving, hoping that she would find her way out, but it only seemed to lead her deeper into the wilderness. Finally, exhausted and scared, Emily collapsed under a tree and tried to rest. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. She heard strange noises and saw shadows moving in the trees. As the night wore on, Emily realized that she was not alone in the woods. Something was stalking her, something dark and sinister. She tried to run, but the woods seemed to twist and turn in on themselves, trapping her in a maze. Finally, just as the first light of dawn began to appear, Emily stumbled upon a clearing. In the center of the clearing was a decrepit old cabin. She hesitated for a moment, but the thought of being lost and alone in the woods was too much to bear. Emily slowly approached the cabin, her heart pounding in her chest. As she got closer, she saw something that made her blood run cold. In the window, she saw a pair of eyes staring back at her, eyes that belonged to something that was not human. With a scream, Emily turned and ran back into the woods, desperate to get as far away from the cabin as possible. She eventually stumbled upon a park ranger who helped her find her way back to the trailhead. But Emily would never forget the terror of that night, or the feeling of being lost in the woods with something sinister lurking just beyond her vision. She never hiked alone again, and the memory of that night haunted her for the rest of her days. It was a dark and stormy night, and Samantha was driving alone on a deserted road. She had been on the road for hours and was tired and hungry. As she drove, she saw a sign for a small town up ahead and decided to stop for a meal and a place to rest for the night. As she drove into the town, she noticed that it was eerily quiet. The streets were empty, and the buildings looked old and abandoned. She found a diner and parked her car outside, but when she walked inside, she found that it was empty. Ignoring her unease, Samantha sat down at the booth and called out for a waiter. But no one answered. She decided to get up and leave, but as she stood, the door to the diner suddenly slammed shut, trapping her inside. Panic set in as she tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, she heard footsteps approaching her from the kitchen. She turned around to see a tall figure in a dark cloak, its face obscured by shadows. The figure moved towards her slowly, and Samantha could feel her heart racing in her chest. She tried to scream, but her throat was dry, and no sound came out. Just as the figure was about to reach her, the lights in the diner flickered on, revealing an empty kitchen and no one in sight. Samantha was left alone, shaken and terrified. She managed to force the door open and ran to her car, driving away as fast as she could. But as she looked back, she could swear she saw the dark figure standing at the edge of the street, watching her with an otherworldly gaze. Sarah and her friends were always looking for something exciting to do on the weekends. One Saturday evening, they decided to explore the abandoned hotel on the outskirts of town. The hotel had been closed for years, and the rumor was that it was haunted. As they entered the hotel, they could hear the sound of their footsteps echoing throughout the empty halls. The air was musty and damp, and they could feel a chill running down their spines. They wandered around the deserted lobby, looking for anything interesting. Suddenly, they heard a faint sound coming from upstairs. They cautiously made their way up the creaky staircase, trying not to make a sound. When they reached the top floor, they saw a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, and they could hear a soft whisper coming from inside. Sarah slowly pushed open the door and they all peered inside. The room was dark, and they could barely make out a figure in the corner. As their eyes adjusted to the darkness, they realized that it was a woman sitting on the floor, rocking back and forth, and muttering to herself. Suddenly, the woman stopped rocking and looked up at them with eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. She stood up and started walking towards them, but her movements were unnatural, almost like a zombie. The group of friends tried to run, but the woman was too fast. She grabbed Sarah by the hair and pulled her back, while the rest of her friends ran down the stairs. They could hear Sarah's screams echoing through the hotel as they made their escape. Years later, the hotel was demolished and a new building was erected in its place. However, some say that on quiet nights, you can still hear Sarah's screams and the sound of the ghostly woman roaming the halls of the new building. There was once a young woman named Emily who had just moved into a new apartment. It was an old building with creaky floors and drafty windows, but Emily didn't mind. She was excited to start this new chapter in her life. But as soon as she settled in, strange things started happening. At first, it was just small things, like a dish moving from one counter to another or a door closing on its own. Emily tried to brush it off as her imagination, but she couldn't ignore it for long. One night, she woke up to the sound of footsteps coming from the hallway. She was alone in the apartment, but the footsteps grew louder and closer until they stopped right outside her bedroom door. Emily was paralyzed with fear, but after a moment of silence, the footsteps retreated back down the hall. The next day, Emily asked her landlord if anyone had ever died in the apartment. The landlord hesitated before telling her that the previous tenant had died in her sleep just a few months ago. Emily felt chills run down her spine. As the days passed, the strange occurrences became more frequent and intense. Emily would wake up to find her furniture rearranged, her clothes thrown on the floor, and strange whispers in the middle of the night. She started to feel like she was losing her mind. One night, she decided to take a sleeping pill to help her sleep through the disturbances. But instead of finding peace, she had a nightmare that she was being chased by the ghost of the previous tenant. The ghost was whispering her name and Emily could feel her icy breath on her neck. When Emily woke up, she found that she was no longer alone in her bed. The ghost of the previous tenant was lying next to her, staring at her with cold, dead eyes. Emily screamed and ran out of the apartment, never to return. Years later, the building was torn down and replaced with a new one. But some say that on quiet nights, you can still hear the whispers of the ghost of the previous tenant, searching for her next victim. Once a successful businessman, John had it all: a beautiful family, a luxurious house, and a promising career. However, things started to take a dark turn when he began feeling a strange presence around him. At first, it was just a feeling of unease, a sense that something was off. But as time passed, John felt like he was losing control of his own mind. It started with forgetfulness, small lapses in memory that he attributed to his busy schedule. But soon, it became clear that something more sinister was at work. John started having vivid nightmares, dreams that felt all too real. In them, he was visited by a shadowy figure, a shapeless mass that whispered to him in a language he couldn't understand. Each night, the figure came closer, its presence suffocating him until he woke up gasping for air. But the nightmares were just the beginning. John began to experience strange sensations, as if something was crawling under his skin. His thoughts became muddled, and he found himself unable to focus on even the simplest tasks. Desperate for answers, John turned to doctors, therapists, and even spiritual healers, but no one could offer any explanation for his condition. As the days passed, John's grip on reality grew more tenuous. He found himself losing control of his body, acting on impulses that he couldn't explain. One night, as John lay in bed, he felt a cold breeze wash over him. The room grew darker, and he knew the figure from his nightmares was near. As he struggled to keep his eyes open, he saw the shadowy mass take shape before him, its form becoming clearer and more defined. In a moment of clarity, John realized that the entity was not outside of him, but inside. It had been slowly taking over his mind, using him as a vessel for its own nefarious purposes. With a final burst of willpower, John fought back against the darkness, screaming for it to leave him alone. When he woke up the next morning, John felt a sense of relief wash over him. The presence was gone, and he was in control of his mind once again. But he knew that the entity was still out there, waiting for its next victim to come along, and he vowed to never let his guard down again. Emma had always been fascinated with the supernatural. She spent her free time reading books about ghosts, demons, and other creatures that lurked in the darkness. One day, she stumbled upon an old book that promised to reveal the secrets of an ancient ritual that could summon a demon. Curiosity got the better of her, and she decided to try it out. She gathered all the necessary ingredients, drew the pentagram, and began the chant. At first, nothing happened. But then, she felt a chill run down her spine. She could feel the air getting colder, and she could hear whispers in the darkness. Suddenly, she was pulled into a different realm, one that was filled with horrors beyond her imagination. Demons roamed the land, and tortured souls screamed in agony. She tried to run, but she was trapped, unable to escape. As the days passed, Emma began to change. She could feel the demon's influence slowly taking over her mind. She started to hear voices in her head, telling her to do unspeakable things. She knew that she had made a terrible mistake, and that she had to find a way out. But the demon wouldn't let her go that easily. It continued to torment her, driving her to the brink of insanity. Emma knew that she had to fight back. With all the strength she had left, she mustered up the courage to confront the demon. It was a fierce battle, but in the end, Emma emerged victorious. She banished the demon back to its own realm, and returned to the world of the living. But the experience had changed her forever. She knew that she could never forget the horrors that she had witnessed, and that she would carry the scars with her for the rest of her life. As a child, Jamie had always been fascinated with the abandoned house at the end of the street. The windows were boarded up, the roof was caving in, and the garden was overgrown with weeds. Many kids claimed to have seen strange things happening in and around the house, but Jamie never believed them. Until the day he decided to explore the abandoned house himself. He slipped through the gap in the fence and pushed open the front door. The air was thick with the smell of damp and decay. The floorboards creaked and groaned under his weight as he made his way through the darkened hallway. He heard whispers and murmurs echoing in the distance, but he couldn't quite make out what they were saying. Jamie crept up the stairs, his heart racing with anticipation. He pushed open a door and found himself in a dusty bedroom. The furniture was covered in cobwebs, and the bed was unmade. But what really caught his attention was the old-fashioned vanity mirror. It was ornately carved, and the glass was darkened with age. As he looked into the mirror, Jamie saw a figure standing behind him. It was a tall, gaunt man with hollow cheeks and sunken eyes. He wore a tattered suit, and his skin was pale and waxy. Jamie turned around, but there was nobody there. He turned back to the mirror, and the figure was still there, looming behind him. Jamie tried to run, but his feet wouldn't move. The figure reached out a bony hand and touched Jamie's shoulder, and a chill ran down his spine. Suddenly, he was falling through the darkness. When he woke up, Jamie was lying on the floor of the abandoned house. The sun was setting outside, and he realized he'd been unconscious for hours. He stumbled to his feet and ran all the way home, vowing never to set foot in the abandoned house again. But that night, he had a nightmare. He dreamed of the gaunt figure from the mirror, standing at the foot of his bed. The figure leaned in close and whispered in his ear, "You can never escape me." Jamie woke up screaming, and he knew he would never be truly free of the abandoned house and the darkness that lurked within it. Once there was a guy named Alex who loved to explore the unknown and paranormal. He had heard about an old cemetery near his town, which was known for being haunted. He had been told that strange things happened there after midnight and that people had seen ghosts wandering around the cemetery. One night, Alex decided to explore the cemetery on his own. He arrived at the cemetery gates around 2 a.m. and walked in. The silence was eerie, and the only sound he could hear was the rustling of leaves under his feet. The moon was hidden behind clouds, making it difficult to see. Alex started to regret his decision, but he shrugged it off and continued to walk deeper into the cemetery. As he walked, he started to feel a chill in the air. He began to see shadows moving around the graves and heard strange noises around him. He tried to ignore them, thinking that it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. Suddenly, he heard a faint whisper calling out his name. He turned around to see where the sound was coming from, but there was no one in sight. He continued to walk, and the whispering grew louder, more persistent. He felt like something invisible was following him, getting closer and closer. He decided to pick up his pace and started to run, but his feet got tangled up with something, and he fell. As he tried to get back up, he felt something cold and bony grabbing his ankle, trying to pull him down into the ground. He screamed and struggled, but the grip was too strong. Eventually, he managed to break free and ran as fast as he could. He could hear the sound of someone or something chasing him, getting closer and closer. When he reached the cemetery gates, he looked back and saw a figure in the darkness, standing still and watching him with glowing eyes. Alex never returned to the cemetery again. He was never the same after that experience and would often wake up in the middle of the night, feeling like someone invisible was still trying to grab his ankle and pull him back into the darkness. There was a young couple, John and Sarah, who decided to go on a weekend getaway to a remote cabin in the woods. As they arrived at the cabin, they noticed that it was very old and creepy looking, but they shrugged it off as part of its charm. As the night fell, they lit a fire and snuggled on the couch to watch a movie. But something felt off. John kept hearing strange noises coming from outside the cabin, but every time he looked out the window, he saw nothing. Sarah noticed John's unease and suggested they go to bed early. As they lay in bed, John tried to shake off the feeling of being watched. Suddenly, he heard a loud noise coming from the living room. He got up to investigate, and as he entered the room, he saw that the door was open, despite him having locked it before going to bed. John and Sarah began to panic, feeling like they were being watched by an unknown presence. They decided to leave the cabin immediately, but as they were packing their bags, they heard footsteps coming from the attic above them. John tried to keep his composure and told Sarah to stay put while he went to check. But as he climbed the stairs to the attic, he saw a shadowy figure lurking in the darkness. John froze in terror as the figure began to approach him, slowly revealing its grotesque face. Sarah heard John's scream and rushed to the stairs, but as she got there, she saw nothing but an empty attic. John was never seen or heard from again, and Sarah was left alone to wonder what happened to her beloved partner in that remote and creepy cabin in the woods. There was a small town nestled deep in the mountains, where the winters were long and brutal. Every year, when the first snowfall hit, the town would close down and the residents would hunker down in their homes, waiting for the spring thaw. But one winter, something strange happened. A young couple, Tom and Emily, moved into a cabin on the outskirts of town. They were excited to start their new life together in the quiet, secluded wilderness. But as the snow piled higher and higher outside, they began to feel uneasy. Strange noises echoed through the woods, and Emily could feel a presence watching them from outside. One night, as they were lying in bed, they heard a faint scratching sound at the door. Tom got up to investigate, but found nothing outside. As they were settling back in, they heard the scratching again, louder this time. Tom opened the door and shone his flashlight into the darkness, but still saw nothing. The scratching continued every night, growing louder and more persistent. Emily became convinced that something was trying to get in. She begged Tom to leave, but he refused, saying that they had nowhere else to go. One night, as they were sitting by the fire, the scratching began again. But this time, it was accompanied by a low growling sound. Tom stood up and grabbed his shotgun, ready to defend himself and Emily. But as he opened the door, a hand reached out from the darkness and pulled him outside. Emily heard his screams as he was dragged away, and she knew she was next. She barricaded herself inside the cabin, but the scratching grew louder and more frenzied. And then, all of a sudden, it stopped. The next morning, when the snowplows came through, they found Emily huddled in the corner of the cabin, her hair turned completely white from shock. She could barely speak, but managed to utter one word, indigo. Sophie had always been fascinated by the abandoned house on the edge of town. It was said to be haunted, and the townspeople avoided it at all costs. But Sophie was not afraid. She was determined to explore the old house and see if there was any truth to the rumors. One night, she sneaked out of her house and made her way to the abandoned house. As she entered the house, she was struck by how eerie it was. The air was thick with dust and cobwebs, and the floorboards creaked beneath her feet. As she made her way through the house, she heard strange noises coming from the walls. At first, she tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, but the sounds grew louder and more persistent. Suddenly, she heard a voice whispering her name. She turned around to see a ghostly figure floating in front of her. It was a young girl, with long black hair and a pale face. Sophie tried to run, but she found that she was frozen in place. The ghostly figure floated closer to her, and Sophie could see that the girl's eyes were hollow and empty. The ghostly figure whispered again, "Why are you here?" Sophie tried to speak, but no words came out. The ghostly figure continued, "You shouldn't be here. This house is cursed." Sophie finally found her voice and asked, "What do you want from me?" The ghostly figure replied, "Leave this place, and never come back." Sophie turned and ran out of the house as fast as she could. As she looked back at the old house, she saw the ghostly figure staring at her through the window. Sophie knew that she had narrowly escaped the haunted house, but the memory of the ghostly figure would haunt her for the rest of her life. Lena had always been fascinated by the abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town. The rumors said that it had been shut down years ago due to unethical medical practices, and that the spirits of those who had suffered and died within its walls still haunted the place. Lena didn't believe in ghosts, and so she decided to explore the abandoned hospital one night. She snuck into the building and started to explore the dusty, abandoned hallways. As she wandered through the building, Lena heard strange noises coming from one of the rooms. She cautiously approached the door and pushed it open, revealing a small, dark room with a single hospital bed. As Lena stepped inside, she felt a sudden chill run down her spine. She looked down at the hospital bed and saw a figure lying there. It was a woman, with long, tangled hair and a pale face. Lena could see that she was barely breathing and her skin was cold to the touch. Lena tried to leave the room, but she found that she was frozen in place. The woman's eyes snapped open, revealing pitch-black pupils. The woman sat up in the bed and started to speak in a voice that sounded like it was coming from the depths of hell. "Get out," the woman hissed. "This place is cursed. It's a place of death and suffering, and you don't belong here." Lena tried to run, but she found that her legs wouldn't move. The woman continued to speak, her voice growing louder and more menacing with every passing second. "You're not safe here," she said. "The ghosts of the dead will come for you. They'll tear you apart and drag you down into the darkness." Lena finally managed to break free of the spell and ran out of the room as fast as she could. As she emerged from the abandoned hospital, she heard the sound of ghostly laughter echoing behind her. From that day on, Lena knew that the rumors about the abandoned hospital were true. It was a place of darkness and death, haunted by the spirits of the dead. She never returned to the hospital again, but the memory of the woman's voice and the feeling of being trapped in that room would stay with her for the rest of her life. It was just another ordinary day for Emily, until she received a text message from an unknown number. The message read, "I'm watching you." Emily brushed it off as a prank and went about her day, but as the day progressed, she received more and more messages from the same number. The messages were getting creepier and creepier, and Emily started to feel uneasy. The messages weren't just random threats anymore. They were more sinister, like someone was taunting her. The messages would say things like, "I know what you did or you can't escape me." Emily tried to block the number, but the messages kept coming. She even went to the police, but they told her that they couldn't do anything unless the person made a direct threat against her. One night, Emily was alone in her apartment when she received another message. This one was different. It was a picture of her apartment building, taken from outside. She could see her own window in the picture, and it looked like someone was watching her from outside. Emily started to panic. She didn't know who was sending her these messages or why. She tried to call her friends and family, but no one answered. She was completely alone. As she sat there, trembling with fear, her phone started to ring. It was the unknown number again. She hesitated before answering, but her curiosity got the better of her. "Hello?" she said, her voice shaking. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, a low, menacing voice spoke. "I told you I was watching you," the voice said. "And now I'm going to come for you." Emily hung up the phone and ran to her door, but it was too late. The door burst open, and a figure emerged from the darkness. Emily tried to scream, but no sound came out. All she could do was watch as the figure slowly advanced toward her, ready to claim its next victim. The next day, Emily's body was found in her apartment. The police searched for the unknown number, but it had vanished without a trace. Emily's friends and family could only wonder who had sent the messages, and what had driven them to commit such a heinous act. There was a legend in the small town of Millfield about a haunted house on the outskirts of town. The house had been abandoned for years, but people still claimed to see strange lights and hear eerie noises coming from inside. One day, a group of teenagers decided to explore the house. They were looking for a thrill, and they figured the old haunted house would be the perfect place to find it. As they approached the house, they could see that it was in a state of disrepair. The windows were boarded up, and the paint was peeling off the walls. But that didn't deter them. They were determined to find out what was inside. The group made their way inside, and as soon as they stepped through the door, they could feel a chill in the air. The house was dark and musty, and it smelled like rotting wood. As they explored the house, they started to hear strange noises. Footsteps creaking on the old wooden floors, whispers coming from the shadows. But every time they turned around, there was nothing there. Finally, they found themselves in the basement. It was pitch black, and they couldn't see anything. But they could hear something moving around in the darkness. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned gown. Her hair was long and unkempt, and her face was twisted in an expression of anger and pain. The teenagers tried to run, but they couldn't find the way out. The woman was chasing them, and a ghostly voice echoed through the halls. "You should not be here," she said. "This is my house, and you are not welcome." The teenagers finally managed to find the front door, but when they opened it, they found themselves in a different place. They were no longer in Millfield. They were in a different town, a different state, a different time. The woman's ghost had transported them to another place, where they were forced to live out the rest of their lives in a world they didn't belong to. And the legend of the haunted house in Millfield lived on, as a warning to those who dared to enter. Maria had always been a skeptical person. She didn't believe in curses, ghosts, or any other supernatural phenomenon. But all of that changed when she visited a small village on the outskirts of the city. While exploring the village, Maria came across an old woman who was selling various items in a small market. The woman looked at Maria and said, "I can see that you're carrying a heavy burden. Would you like me to help you lift it?" Maria was taken aback by the woman's words. She didn't know what she was talking about, but she was curious. So she nodded her head in agreement. The woman took out a small vial and handed it to Maria. "Drink this," she said. "It will cleanse your spirit and lift the burden from your soul." Maria didn't think twice. She took the vial and drank it without hesitation. But as soon as she swallowed it, she felt a strange sensation in her body. It was like her spirit was engulfed in a never-ending fire. At first, Maria thought it was just a side effect of the potion, and that it would go away soon. But it didn't. The fire kept burning, and it was getting worse by the day. Maria went to see a doctor, but he couldn't find anything wrong with her. He ran all kinds of tests, but they all came back negative. The doctor told Maria that she was probably just experiencing some kind of mental breakdown, and that she should seek help from a therapist. But Maria knew that it wasn't in her head. The fire was real, and it was consuming her from the inside out. She tried to explain to the doctors what was happening to her, but they all dismissed her as being insane. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Maria was left to suffer in silence, with no one to help her. She could feel her spirit slowly being consumed by the fire, and she knew that it wouldn't be long before it destroyed her completely. One day, Maria went back to the village where she had met the old woman. She searched high and low for her, hoping that she could help her lift the curse that had been placed on her. But the old woman was nowhere to be found. It was like she had disappeared into thin air. Maria realized then that she was alone in her suffering. The curse had taken hold of her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She would be left to suffer in agony for the rest of her life, with no one to help her. And so, Maria became a shell of her former self. She was consumed by the fire, and her spirit was destroyed. The curse had claimed another victim, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. There was a small town that was surrounded by a dense forest. The townspeople had always been wary of the forest, believing it to be cursed. They avoided it at all costs, and no one ever ventured into its depths. One day, a group of teenagers decided to explore the forest. They had heard stories of strange creatures and supernatural phenomena that lived within its borders, and they were eager to uncover its secrets. As they made their way deeper into the forest, they began to hear strange noises. It was like someone or something was watching them, but they couldn't see anything. Suddenly, they came across a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a tall, ancient tree. The tree was unlike any they had ever seen before, with twisted roots and branches that seemed to reach towards the sky. As they approached the tree, they noticed that there was something hanging from one of its branches. It was a small, wooden box, intricately carved with strange symbols. The teenagers were hesitant at first, but their curiosity got the best of them. They opened the box, and inside, they found a small, silver key. The key seemed to call out to them, and they knew that they had to find out what it unlocked. They searched the forest for hours, looking for anything that the key might fit into. As they were about to give up, they stumbled upon an old, abandoned house. It was hidden deep within the forest, and they had never seen it before. They tried the key in the lock, and to their surprise, it opened. They cautiously entered the house, and as they explored its dark, eerie rooms, they realized that something was off. The furniture was covered in dust and cobwebs, as if it had been touched in years. But there were also strange symbols etched into the walls and floors, and strange, otherworldly objects scattered throughout the rooms. As they continued to explore, they came across a locked door. They tried the key, and it opened with ease. But what they found inside the room was beyond anything they could have imagined. It was a portal to another world, a world filled with monsters and demons and unspeakable horrors. They had unwittingly unleashed an ancient evil that had been trapped behind the door for centuries. And now, it was free to wreak havoc on the world once again. The teenagers tried to flee, but it was too late. The creatures from the other world had already taken hold of the town, and there was no escape. And that's when they realized the shocking truth. The cursed forest was never meant to keep the monsters out, it was meant to keep them in. And now, they had unleashed them upon the world. The teenagers were responsible for dooming their town, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The only thing left to do was to pray for a miracle, and hope that somehow, they could make things right. There was a woman named Sarah who had always been jealous of her friend, Emily. Emily was kind and beautiful, and everyone loved her. Sarah, on the other hand, felt invisible. One day, Sarah's jealousy got the best of her, and she did something terrible. She betrayed Emily, spreading rumors about her that were completely false. Emily was devastated, and their friendship was shattered. Sarah felt guilty about what she had done, but she was too afraid to admit the truth to Emily and ask for forgiveness. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Sarah tried to forget about what she had done, but she couldn't escape the guilt that was eating away at her. And then, the haunting began. It started with small things, like objects moving on their own and strange whispers in the night. But it quickly escalated to something much more sinister. Sarah would wake up in the middle of the night to find Emily standing at the foot of her bed, her eyes glowing with anger and betrayal. Emily's voice would echo through Sarah's mind, reminding her of what she had done and how she had hurt her. Sarah tried to ignore it, but the haunting only got worse. Emily's ghost would follow her wherever she went, and Sarah could feel her presence constantly. She became paranoid and afraid, and she couldn't escape the guilt and shame that consumed her. Finally, Sarah could take it no longer. She knew what she had to do. She went to Emily's grave and begged for forgiveness, tears streaming down her face. And then, something miraculous happened. Emily's ghost appeared before her, no longer filled with anger and betrayal. Instead, she was at peace. Emily forgave Sarah, and the haunting stopped. Sarah was finally able to let go of the guilt and shame that had been haunting her for so long. She knew that she could never undo what she had done, but she could make amends and try to be a better person in the future. From that day on, Sarah was a changed woman. She had learned that the cost of betrayal was too high, and that the ghosts of the past could haunt you for a long time if you didn't confront them. Emily was a kind and gentle soul who had a heart full of love for everyone. She had a smile that could light up a room and a laugh that could make even the grumpiest person feel happy. But one day, Emily disappeared. Her family and friends searched for her everywhere, but she was nowhere to be found. They put up posters around town, organized search parties, and even hired private investigators, but no one could find any trace of her. Months passed, and everyone gave up hope of ever finding Emily alive. Her family held a memorial service, and her friends tried to move on with their lives, but they could never forget her. And then, one day, her body was found. It was discovered in a shallow grave in the woods, buried under a pile of leaves and dirt. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the head, and it was clear that Emily had been murdered. The news sent shockwaves through the community. Everyone was devastated by the loss of such a kind and loving person, and they were outraged that someone could do something so cruel. The police launched an investigation, but the killer was never found. There were no witnesses, no DNA evidence, and no leads. The case went cold, and Emily's murder remained a mystery. But Emily's ghost refused to rest. She haunted the town, appearing to people in their dreams and leaving mysterious signs and symbols around the area where her body had been found. She was determined to find justice, even if it meant haunting the living. The ghostly sightings and strange symbols continued for years, until finally, a breakthrough was made. A new piece of evidence was discovered, and it led the police to a suspect. It turned out to be someone who had been close to Emily, someone who had been jealous of her and had wanted her out of the way. The killer was arrested and put on trial. The evidence was strong, and they were found guilty of Emily's murder. They were sentenced to life in prison, and justice was finally served. Emily's ghost was finally at peace. She could rest knowing that her killer was behind bars and that justice had been done. The town could finally move on from the tragedy, but they would never forget Emily and the impact she had on their lives. Lena was a journalist who specialized in investigating supernatural occurrences. She was known for her boldness and her willingness to go to any lengths to uncover the truth, no matter how dangerous it was. One day, Lena received a tip about a haunted house on the outskirts of town. She knew it was the perfect opportunity to prove herself and decided to investigate. The house was old and abandoned, and the surrounding area was overgrown with weeds and trees. The front door was boarded up, but Lena managed to find a way inside through a broken window. As she explored the house, she felt a strange presence. She heard footsteps and voices, but when she turned around, there was no one there. The air was cold and musty, and the furniture was covered in dust and cobwebs. Lena took out her recorder and started asking questions, hoping to capture any evidence of the supernatural. But as she spoke, she heard a voice respond. It was a deep, menacing voice that sent shivers down her spine. She realized that she was not alone in the house. She was being watched by someone or something. Lena's heart raced as she tried to find a way out, but the doors and windows were all locked. She was trapped, and she knew she had to face whatever was haunting the house. And then, she saw it. In the dim light of the house, Lena saw a figure standing in the shadows. It was tall and thin, with long fingers and a twisted face. It was the stuff of nightmares, and Lena froze in terror. But then, the figure stepped into the light, and Lena saw the truth. It was not a monster, but a man wearing a mask. The voice that she had heard was just a recording that he had played to scare her. Lena realized that she had been duped. The haunted house was just a trap set up to scare her and make her look foolish. She was relieved to be safe, but she was also embarrassed that she had fallen for such a cheap trick. As she left the house, Lena realized that she had been so focused on uncovering the supernatural that she had forgotten to be skeptical. She vowed to never let her guard down again, and to always approach her investigations with caution and skepticism. But as she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something supernatural lurking in the shadows, watching her every move. Once upon a time, in a small town in the middle of nowhere, there lived a man named Samuel. He was a cunning and manipulative person who had no regard for anyone but himself. Samuel would often take advantage of people in the town, making deals and promises he had no intention of keeping. He was a wealthy man, but his wealth came at the expense of others. One day, Samuel made a deal with a group of people in the town to buy their land for a price lower than its actual value. The people agreed, but little did they know, Samuel had no intention of paying them at all. He had found a loophole in the contract that allowed him to keep the land without ever having to pay for it. The people in the town were outraged and they tried to take illegal action against Samuel, but he had already bribed the judge and had the case dismissed. In revenge, the people of the town decided to put a curse on Samuel. They went to a local witch and asked her to put a hex on Samuel that would make him suffer the consequences of his actions. The witch agreed to their request and cast a powerful spell on Samuel. From that day on, Samuel began to experience strange and terrifying things. At first, he would hear voices whispering his name in the dead of night, but he couldn't find the source of the sounds. Then, he began to see shadows moving in the corners of his eyes, and he felt a constant sense of unease whenever he was alone. But it wasn't until one dark and stormy night that Samuel truly felt the weight of the curse. As he was walking home from the local tavern, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. When he turned around, there was no one there. He shrugged it off and kept walking, but the footsteps persisted. Suddenly, a hand reached out and grabbed his shoulder, causing him to jump in terror. Samuel turned around to see a ghostly figure standing before him. It was one of the people he had betrayed, and it was clear that they were not at peace. The figure pointed a bony finger at Samuel and whispered, "You will pay for your sins." From that moment on, Samuel's life became a living nightmare. Everywhere he went, he was haunted by the ghosts of the people he had wronged. He saw their faces in the shadows and heard their voices in the wind. He became a recluse, too afraid to leave his house, but the ghosts found a way to enter his home too. They would move objects, slam doors, and even whisper in his ear as he slept. Samuel's mental state deteriorated rapidly and he began to suffer from hallucinations and paranoid delusions. He became convinced that the ghosts were real and that they were out to get him. One night, in a fit of madness, Samuel set fire to his own house, hoping to destroy the ghosts once and for all. But the fire consumed him as well, and he perished in the flames. The people of the town never forgot what Samuel had done to them. but they also never forgot the lesson they learned from his tragic fate. They knew that their actions could have unintended consequences, and they resolved to never let greed and anger cloud their judgment again. In a small town nestled deep in the woods, there was a house that everyone knew to stay away from. It was said that anyone who entered the house would never come back out. But one day, a group of teenagers decided to explore the house, just for fun. As they entered the house, they could feel an eerie presence. The walls were covered in cobwebs, and the air was musty and damp. Suddenly, they heard a creaking sound coming from upstairs. Curiosity getting the best of them, they slowly made their way up the staircase. As they approached a room at the end of the hallway, they heard whispers coming from inside. They pushed the door open and saw an old woman sitting in a rocking chair. She turned to face them, revealing a face that looked like it had been rotting for years. The teenagers screamed and tried to run, but the door slammed shut, trapping them inside. The old woman cackled as she revealed her true form, a witch who had been luring unsuspecting victims into her lair for centuries. Just when the teenagers thought they were done for, the witch suddenly froze in place. Her skin turned to stone, and her eyes became lifeless. Confused, the teenagers looked around the room and saw a small girl standing in the corner, holding a wand. The girl explained that she had been trapped by the witch for years and had finally managed to escape. She had been practicing magic ever since, waiting for someone to come along and help her defeat the witch once and for all. Together, the teenagers and the girl used their combined powers to break the witch's spell and destroy her once and for all. As they walked out of the house, they realized that the small girl was actually a powerful witch in training, who had orchestrated the entire event to test her skills and defeat the evil witch that had been terrorizing the town for centuries. The teenagers couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. They had gone on from being terrified victims to heroes, and would never forget the lessons they learned and the challenges they overcame. It was a dark and stormy night, and a group of friends decided to take a shortcut through the woods to get to their cabin. As they walked, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. But they brushed it off as just their imagination. As they reached the cabin, they realized that the power was out and they had no cell phone signal. They lit candles and started telling each other scary stories to pass the time. Suddenly, they heard a loud banging on the door. They froze in fear, but then realized it was just the wind. But then, they heard footsteps outside, and they knew someone or something was out there. They huddled together, trying to stay quiet, but then they heard a voice whispering their names. They were terrified and didn't know what to do. Then, the door burst open and a figure stood in the doorway. They couldn't make out who it was in the darkness, but they could feel its cold breath on their faces. The figure moved closer, and they realized it was a ghost. They screamed and tried to run, but they were trapped. Just as they thought it was all over, the ghost spoke. "I am not here to harm you," it said. "I am here to warn you. Leave this cabin and never come back, or suffer the same fate as the family who used to live here." The group quickly left the cabin, and as they walked away, they saw a flash of light in the windows. They turned back to see the cabin burst into flames. The group was shocked and grateful to the ghost for saving their lives. They never returned to the cabin, but the memory of that night stayed with them forever. It was a dark and stormy night, and Jane was driving home from a late-night shift at the hospital. She had taken a shortcut through the woods to avoid a congested main road, but she soon regretted her decision. As she drove deeper into the woods, the rain intensified, and the wind howled like a pack of wolves. Suddenly, a car hit something in the road, and she heard a loud thud. She got out of the car and found a dead deer lying on the ground, its eyes staring blankly up at the sky. Jane was horrified but knew she had to keep going. She got back in the car and continued driving, but something didn't feel right. The trees seemed to be closing in on her, and the rain sounded like whispers in her ear. As she drove on, the road became narrower, and the trees became denser. Suddenly, she saw a figure in the middle of the road, and she slammed on the brakes. It was a woman, dressed in a white gown, with long black hair covering her face. Jane was frozen with fear. She tried to reverse, but her car wouldn't budge. The woman started to walk towards her, slowly but surely. Jane tried to call for help, but her phone had no signal. The woman reached the car and knocked on the window. Jane was too scared to move. The woman's hair moved to reveal a pale face, with eyes as black as coal. Jane screamed, but no sound came out. Suddenly, the woman smiled, revealing a set of sharp teeth. "I've been waiting for you," she said, before disappearing into the woods. Jane was petrified, but eventually, she managed to start her car and drive away as fast as she could. She got home safely, but she couldn't shake off the feeling that something was still following her. As she entered her house, she saw a figure sitting on her couch. It was the woman from the woods. Jane screamed, but the woman spoke softly. "Don't be afraid," she said. "I'm here to help you." Jane was confused but listened to what the woman had to say. She revealed that she was a spirit, who had died in the woods many years ago. She had been waiting for someone to help her cross over to the other side. Jane realized that she was the only one who could help the woman. She agreed to help, and the woman disappeared. The next day, Jane went back to the woods and found the woman's body. She performed a ritual and helped the woman's spirit cross over. From that day on, Jane never took shortcuts through the woods again. She knew that the spirits of the dead were always watching, waiting for someone to help them move on to the next world. It was the dead of night, and Emily was walking home from a friend's house. She had had a few drinks, but she wasn't drunk. As she walked down the dark, empty street, she couldn't shake off the feeling that she was being watched. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned around, but there was no one there. She picked up her pace and tried to ignore the feeling of dread that was creeping up on her. As she turned the corner, she saw a figure standing in front of her. It was a tall, dark figure, with glowing red eyes. Emily froze in terror. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The figure started to move towards her, slowly but surely. Emily tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure got closer and closer, until it was right in front of her. Suddenly, the figure spoke. "Don't be afraid," it said. "I'm here to protect you." Emily was confused. She had never heard of a protective figure with glowing red eyes, but she didn't have time to ask questions. The figure led her down a dark alleyway and into a hidden basement. The basement was dimly lit, but Emily could see that there were several other people there. They all looked scared and confused, just like her. The figure turned to Emily and spoke again. "Listen carefully," it said. "You are all in danger. There is a group of people who want to harm you. They will stop at nothing to get what they want. But I won't let them. I will protect you, no matter what." Emily didn't know what to think. She had never been in a situation like this before. But she trusted the figure, and she knew that she had to do what it said. The figure handed her a weapon, and Emily realized that she was not alone. There were others there who were ready to fight for their lives. She took a deep breath and prepared for what was to come. Suddenly, the basement door burst open, and a group of men entered. They were armed and dangerous, and Emily knew that they meant business. But she was ready. She fought with all her might, and she didn't give up until the last man was defeated. As the fight ended, the figure stepped forward, "You have done well," it said. "You have proved that you are strong and brave. I will always be here to protect you." Emily was relieved, but she had one question. "Who are you?" she asked. The figure smiled. "I am your guardian angel," it said. "And I will always be with you, no matter what." It was a warm summer night, and Lily was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep. She had just finished reading a scary novel, and her mind was racing with thoughts of ghosts and monsters. As she closed her eyes, she heard a faint tapping sound coming from the window. She tried to ignore it, but it continued. She got out of bed and walked over to the window. As she peered outside, she saw a figure standing in the shadows. Lily was scared, but she recognized the figure. It was her best friend, Sarah. Lily quickly opened the window, and Sarah climbed inside. "Lily, you have to help me," Sarah said. "I'm being followed." Lily was confused. "What do you mean you're being followed?" she asked. Sarah's face was pale with fear. "I don't know who they are," she said. "But they've been following me for days. I can't take it anymore." Lily knew that she had to help her friend. She got dressed and grabbed a flashlight. Together, they snuck out of the house and into the darkness. As they walked through the quiet streets, Lily couldn't shake off the feeling that they were being watched. They turned a corner, and Lily saw a figure in the distance. It was a man, dressed in black, with a hood covering his face. Lily tried to keep her cool, but her heart was racing. She knew that they had to get away, but it was too late. The man had seen them, and he started to run towards them. Lily and Sarah ran as fast as they could. They turned another corner and found themselves at a dead end. The man was closing in on them, and Lily knew that they had no escape. Suddenly, Sarah grabbed Lily's hand and pulled her towards a hidden door in the wall. Lily had never seen the door before, but Sarah seemed to know where it led. They opened the door and ran down a flight of stairs. They found themselves in an old basement. It was dark and musty, and Lily could barely see anything. But she could hear footsteps behind them, and she knew that they had to keep moving. They found another door and opened it. They stepped into a room that was filled with light. There were people there, and they looked up when Lily and Sarah entered. Lily recognized some of them. They were her friends and family. Lily was confused. "What's going on?" she asked. Sarah turned to her with a smile. "Welcome to the safe house," she said. "We've been waiting for you." Lily realized that the safe house was a secret organization that helped people who were in danger. She had always heard rumors about it, but she never believed that it was real. Sarah explained that they had been following her for weeks, and they had finally decided that she was worthy of joining their cause. Lily was stunned, but she knew that she had found her true purpose in life. From that day on, Lily worked with the safe house to help others who were in danger. She never forgot a night when Sarah had saved her life, and she was grateful for the opportunity to make a difference in the world. Emily and her friends were on a camping trip in the mountains. They had pitched their tents by a beautiful lake and were enjoying the serene scenery. As night fell, they gathered around the campfire and roasted marshmallows. Emily felt relaxed and happy, surrounded by her closest friends. As they were getting ready to go to bed, they heard strange noises in the woods. Emily's friend, Emma, suggested that it might be a bear, but Emily wasn't convinced. She had a feeling that there was something more sinister out there. Despite her unease, Emily went to bed and fell asleep. But she was awakened by the sound of footsteps outside her tent. She tried to stay calm and listened carefully, hoping that it was just one of her friends going to the bathroom. But the footsteps continued, and they were getting closer. Emily's heart was pounding in her chest, and she knew that she had to do something. She grabbed her flashlight and cautiously unzipped the tent. What she saw made her scream in terror. There was a figure standing outside her tent, dressed in a black cloak, with a pale face and empty eyes. Emily's friends woke up and rushed outside their tents, but the figure was already gone. They spent the rest of the night huddled together, too afraid to go back to sleep. In the morning, they packed up their things and left the campsite as quickly as possible. As they were driving down the mountain, they saw a strange building in the distance. It was an old mansion, and it looked abandoned. But something about it made Emily feel drawn to it. She convinced her friends to stop the car and investigate. They walked towards the mansion and found the front door unlocked. As they stepped inside, they were greeted by a strange sight. The mansion was filled with people, all dressed in black cloaks, with pale faces and empty eyes. Emily's friends panicked and ran out of the mansion, but Emily was transfixed. She recognized the people as the same figures that had haunted her dreams for years. They had always seemed so real, but she had never been able to explain them. But now, as she looked around the mansion, she realized the truth. The figures weren't ghosts or monsters, but people who had been brainwashed by a cult. They had been living in the mansion, cut off from the rest of the world, and practicing strange rituals. Emily's world had been turned upside down. She realized that the things she had feared the most were actually real, but in a way that she had never imagined. She knew that she had to be careful, but she couldn't shake off the feeling that the cult was still out there, watching her every move. It was a dark and stormy night, and Lily was alone in her apartment. She had just finished a long day at work and was looking forward to a quiet night in. But as the thunder rumbled outside, she started to feel uneasy. Lily tried to ignore her fears and settled down on the couch with a book. But as she read, she kept feeling like she was being watched. She looked around her room, but there was no one there. Suddenly, the power went out, plunging the apartment into darkness. Lily tried to stay calm and fumbled around for a flashlight. She heard a noise from the kitchen and went to investigate. As she entered the kitchen, Lily saw a figure standing in the shadows. It was a man, with a hood over his head and a knife in his hand. Lily froze, too terrified to move. The man took a step towards her, and Lily braced herself for the worst. But then, the man removed his hood, revealing a familiar face. It was her neighbor, Jack. Jack explained that he had been out in the storm and his power had gone out too. He had come to borrow some candles and had entered the apartment without knocking. Lily felt relieved and embarrassed for her overreaction. But as Jack left, Lily couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. She went to her bedroom and saw that her jewelry box had been opened. She had been robbed, and Jack was the only one who could have done it. Lily called the police, and they arrested Jack. He had been a serial burglar, breaking into his neighbors' homes and stealing their valuables. Lily had narrowly escaped becoming his next victim. As Lily lay in bed at night, she realized how close she had come to danger. She had let her guard down with someone she thought she could trust, and it had almost cost her everything. She knew that she would never be able to forget that night, and the fear that had consumed her. Samantha had always loved hiking, so when her friends suggested a weekend camping trip in the wilderness, she jumped at the chance. They packed their gear and headed into the forest, eager for adventure. As they set up camp, they noticed that there were no other hikers in the area. It was strange, but they assumed that it was because they had chosen a remote location. They spent the day exploring the woods and taking in the beauty of nature. That night, as they were sitting around the campfire, they heard strange noises coming from the woods. Samantha's friend, Rachel, suggested that it might be animals, but Samantha felt like something was off. She had a feeling that they weren't alone. As they settled into their tents, Samantha couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. She felt like she was being watched. She tried to calm herself down and drifted off to sleep. But in the middle of the night, Samantha was awoken by a loud noise. She sat up and listened, trying to figure out what it was. It sounded like footsteps, and they were getting closer. Samantha grabbed her flashlight and unzipped the tent. As she shone the light outside, she saw a figure standing in the shadows. It was a man, dressed in ragged clothes, with wild eyes and a knife in his hand. Samantha screamed and tried to run, but the man was too fast. He caught up to her and grabbed her by the arm. Samantha struggled and screamed, but he dragged her deeper into the woods. As they went deeper into the woods, Samantha's fear turned into confusion. The man wasn't trying to hurt her. In fact, he seemed to be leading her somewhere. Eventually, they arrived at a clearing, where Samantha saw something that made her blood run cold. There were dozens of people in the clearing, all dressed in ragged clothes, with wild eyes and knives in their hands. They were chanting something in a language that Samantha didn't recognize. But then, something even more shocking happened. One of the people in the group turned around and looked straight at Samantha. It was her long-lost brother, who had disappeared years ago and was presumed dead. Samantha was stunned. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. But then, she realized that her brother had been taken in by a cult. They had brainwashed him and turned him into a follower. Samantha managed to escape from the cult and alert the authorities. Her brother was eventually rescued and deprogrammed. But the experience left Samantha with a deep sense of trauma. She had gone on a camping trip with her friends and had returned with a shattered sense of reality. Emma had always been fascinated by ghosts and the supernatural. She often spent her weekends exploring abandoned buildings and looking for signs of paranormal activity. One day, she heard about a haunted house on the outskirts of town, and she couldn't resist the temptation to investigate. She packed her equipment and drove to the house. It was old and decrepit, with broken windows and overgrown grass. As she stepped inside, she felt a chill run down her spine. She knew that she was in the presence of something otherworldly. Emma explored the house, taking pictures and recording EVP sessions. But as the night wore on, she started to feel like she wasn't alone. She heard whispers and footsteps, and saw shadows moving in the corner of her eye. She felt like the spirits in the house were trying to communicate with her. As she was walking down the hallway, she heard a loud noise from upstairs. She cautiously climbed the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. She entered one of the bedrooms and saw a figure standing in the corner. It was a woman, dressed in white, with long black hair. Emma felt like she had seen her before, but she couldn't remember where. The woman beckoned her to come closer, and Emma took a step towards her. But then, the woman disappeared, and Emma heard a loud thud from behind her. She turned around and saw that the door had slammed shut, trapping her in the room. She tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Emma was stuck in the room, alone in the dark. She felt like the spirits in the house were closing in on her, and she knew that she was in grave danger. But then, something unexpected happened. The door opened, and Emma saw a man standing in the doorway. He was holding a flashlight, and his face was twisted in fear. The man explained that he was the owner of the house, and he had been trying to scare away trespassers. He had dressed up as a ghost to frighten Emma, but he had never intended to hurt her. Emma felt relieved but also embarrassed. She had let her fascination with the supernatural cloud her judgment, and she had put herself in danger. She knew that she needed to be more careful in the future, and that ghosts weren't always what they seemed. Mia had always been fascinated by dreams. She was a vivid dreamer and often had strange and surreal dreams that left her feeling disoriented and unsettled. But lately, she had been having recurring dreams about a man she didn't seem to know. In the dreams, the man would appear to her as a ghostly figure, always just out of reach. He would speak to her in hushed tones, telling her that he was a real person who had somehow become trapped in the dream realm. He begged her to help him escape and return to reality. At first, Mia thought it was just a product of her overactive imagination. But the dreams continued, night after night, and she started to feel like there was something more to them. One night, the man in her dreams spoke to her more urgently than ever before. He told her that time was running out, and that she was his only hope. He gave her a set of instructions that she needed to follow to rescue him from the dream realm. Mia was skeptical, but something in the man's voice convinced her to try. She followed his instructions carefully, and soon found herself in a strange and otherworldly place that she had never seen before. It was a place of shifting shapes and colors, where the laws of physics didn't seem to apply. She searched the dream realm, following the man's instructions, until she finally found him. He was trapped in a bubble of shifting colors, his body flickering like a candle flame. Mia approached the bubble and reached out to touch it. As soon as she did, she felt a shock run through her body, and she was pulled into the bubble with the man. For a moment, they floated in the bubble together, surrounded by the shifting colors and shapes of the dream realm. But then, the colors started to fade, and Mia felt herself being pulled back to reality. When she opened her eyes, she was lying on her bed, with the man beside her. He was real, just as he had said he was, and he looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and relief. He explained to Mia that he had been trapped in the dream realm for years, unable to escape. He had tried to reach out to other people, but nobody had been able to hear him, except for Mia. Mia couldn't believe what had happened. She had rescued a man from the dream realm, something that she had never even thought was possible. But as she looked at the man beside her, she felt a creeping sense of unease. There was something about him that she couldn't quite place. His face seemed familiar, but she couldn't remember where she had seen it before. And then, she realized what it was. The man in her dream was her long-lost uncle, who had disappeared without a trace when she was a child. She had never known what had happened to him, but now she had found him, trapped in the dream realm. Mia felt a wave of sadness wash over her. She had rescued her uncle, but it was too late. He had been trapped in the dream realm for too long, and he had lost himself to the shifting colors and shapes of the dream world. Mia knew that she would never forget her uncle's face, and the eerie feeling that came with it. She had rescued him, but in doing so, she had uncovered a secret that had been buried for years. And she knew that she would never look at dreams in the same way again. It was a dark and stormy night, and Emma was driving home from a late shift at work. The rain was pouring down so hard that she could barely see the road ahead of her. As she approached a sharp turn, her headlights caught something in the distance. It was a woman, drenched and shivering, standing on the side of the road. Emma slowed down and rolled down her window to ask if the woman needed help. The woman stepped closer to the car, and Emma could see that her face was contorted with fear. "Please, you have to help me," she begged. "My car broke down a few miles back, and I've been walking in the rain for hours. I just need a ride to the next town." Feeling sorry for the woman, Emma unlocked the passenger door and let her in. As soon as the woman got into the car, Emma noticed that her hands were ice cold, and her clothes were clinging to her body. Emma asked the woman if she was okay, but she didn't answer. Instead, She just stared out the window, her eyes fixed on something in the darkness. As Emma drove further into the storm, she began to feel uneasy. The woman's silence was unsettling, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Suddenly, the woman's head snapped around, and she looked Emma directly in the eye. Her expression was twisted and malicious, and Emma knew that she was in danger. Before Emma could react, the woman lunged at her with a knife. Emma swerved the car off the road, and the two of them tumbled out onto the ground. In the chaos, Emma managed to grab the knife and defend herself. As she held the woman at bay, Emma realized that she recognized her face. It was her own reflection staring back at her from a nearby puddle. Emma had been driving herself insane, haunted by a traumatic event that had happened years ago. The woman in the storm was just a figment of her imagination. Shaken by the realization, Emma drove home, grateful to be alive. But as she walked through the front door, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Standing in the hallway was the woman from the storm, real this time, and she was holding a knife. Jenny had always loved hiking. There was something about the wilderness that spoke to her soul, and she loved the feeling of being out in the open air, surrounded by nothing but nature. One weekend, Jenny decided to take a solo hike in the mountains. She had been on this trail before, so she felt confident that she could handle it on her own. She packed a backpack with some snacks and water, put on her hiking boots, and set off. At first, the hike went smoothly. Jenny felt invigorated by the fresh air and the exercise, and she enjoyed the feeling of solitude as she made her way up the mountain. But as she got higher, the trail became steeper and more treacherous. She had to scramble up rocks and navigate narrow ledges, and she started to feel a bit uneasy. She had underestimated the difficulty of the trail, and now she was worried that she might not make it back down safely. As she climbed higher, the trail became more and more narrow. It was little more than a rocky ledge, with a sheer drop-off on one side. Jenny had to hug the wall of the mountain to keep her balance, and she felt her heart racing as she looked down at the dizzying drop below. And that's when she saw it. A figure, standing on the ledge just ahead of her. At first, Jenny thought it was another hiker, but as she got closer, she realized that it was something else entirely. The figure was tall and thin, with long arms and legs that seemed to be made of twigs and branches. Its face was obscured by a tangle of vines and leaves, and its eyes glowed with an eerie green light. Jenny froze in terror. She had never seen anything like it before, and she didn't know what to do. But the figure didn't seem to notice her. It just stood there, swaying slightly in the breeze. Jenny didn't know how long she stood there, watching the figure. It felt like hours, but it could have been only minutes. Eventually, she managed to summon up the courage to move again. She inched her way past the figure, keeping her eyes down and her breath shallow. But as she passed the figure, she felt a jolt of pain in her leg. She looked down to see a vine wrapped tightly around her ankle, and she realized that she had been caught in a trap. The vines started to pull her toward the edge of the ledge, and she screamed in terror. She tried to claw her way back, but the vines were too strong. Just as she thought she was going to be pulled over the edge, the figure reached out a hand and grabbed her. Its touch was cold and clammy, like the touch of a dead thing. For a moment, Jenny thought that she was saved. But then, she realized that the figure wasn't trying to help her. It was pulling her closer, its green eyes glowing brighter and brighter. And that's when Jenny realized the shocking truth. The figure was not some monster or ghost, but a human being, twisted and distorted by the magic of the mountain. It was too late for Jenny to save herself. She was pulled over the edge, tumbling down the mountain, but not before catching a glimpse of the twisted face of the figure that had trapped her. Jenny's body was never found, and her disappearance remains a mystery to this day. But those who hike the trail say that they can sometimes hear her screams echoing through the mountains, and that they catch glimpses of the figure that took her, stalking through the wilderness. Emily had always been fascinated by the paranormal. She loved reading about ghosts and hauntings, and she spent hours watching videos of supernatural phenomena on YouTube. One day, Emily decided to take her interest in the paranormal to the next level. She signed up for a ghost tour of an old abandoned prison on the outskirts of town. The tour started at sunset, and Emily was thrilled as she followed the guide through the dark and creepy corridors of the prison. She listened eagerly as the guide told stories of the inmates who had been executed there, and of the ghostly apparitions that still haunted the halls. But as the tour went on, Emily began to feel uneasy. She felt like she was being watched, like someone was following her through the shadows. At one point, the group stopped in front of a cell that was said to be particularly haunted. The guide recounted the story of a notorious serial killer who had been locked up in that very cell before he was executed. Emily was captivated by the story, and she stepped closer to the cell to get a better look. And that's when she saw it. A figure, standing in the cell, staring back at her with cold, dead eyes. Emily froze in terror. She had never seen anything like it before. The figure was not a ghost or an apparition, but a real person, standing in the cell and staring at her. The figure stepped closer, and Emily could see that he was not a ghost at all, but a living, breathing man. He was tall and thin, with greasy hair and a wild look in his eyes. Emily stumbled back, but the man grabbed her arm and pulled her into the cell. She screamed for help, but the other members of the tour were too far away to hear her. The man held her tightly, and Emily could feel his breath on her neck. She was sure that he was going to kill her. But then, something strange happened. The man's grip loosened, and he looked up in terror. Emily followed his gaze and saw something that made her blood run cold. A group of ghostly figures, floating in the air above them, with cold, dead eyes and twisted faces. They reached down and grabbed the man, pulling him up into the air and dragging him away. Emily was left alone in the cell, shaking with fear. She had always wanted to see a ghost, but she never imagined that she would be saved by one. As she stumbled out of the cell, she realized that the man she had seen was not a serial killer at all, but a deranged man who had been living in the prison, hiding from the law. Emily never forgot the terror of that night, but she also never forgot the strange and supernatural forces that had saved her life. She knew that she would never be the same again. Sarah had always been fascinated by the abandoned house at the end of her street. It had been vacant for as long as she could remember, and the old, creaky building seemed to hold endless secrets and mysteries. One day, Sarah decided to explore the abandoned house. She climbed through a broken window and started to explore the dusty, cobweb-filled rooms. As she made her way through the house, she heard strange noises coming from upstairs. At first, she thought it was just the old house settling, but as the noises grew louder and more persistent, she started to feel uneasy. She cautiously climbed the stairs and followed the sounds to a locked door at the end of the hallway. Sarah's curiosity got the better of her, and she jimmied the lock with a hairpin. As she pushed open the door, she was hit with a foul smell that made her gag. The room was pitch black, and Sarah couldn't see a thing. But then, she heard a faint whisper, coming from somewhere in the darkness. "Help me." The voice was barely audible, but Sarah could feel the desperation in it. She slowly made her way into the room, her heart racing with fear. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, Sarah could make out a figure lying on the ground. She stepped closer, and her stomach turned at the sight before her. It was a young girl, lying motionless on the ground. Her face was twisted in agony, and her skin was a sickly grey color. Sarah realized with horror that the girl was dead. As she turned to run from the room, she heard the whisper again. "Help me." Sarah hesitated for a moment, her heart racing. She knew that she should leave the house and call the police, but something inside her told her to stay and help the girl. She slowly approached the body and reached out to touch it. And that's when something unexpected happened. The girl's eyes snapped open, and she sat up, screaming. Sarah stumbled back in terror, but the girl reached out and grabbed her. It was then that Sarah realized the shocking truth. The girl was not dead at all, but had been lying in a deep, coma-like state. She had been trapped in the abandoned house for years, and her only hope of escape was to lure someone in to help her. But now that Sarah had awakened her, there was no turning back. The girl had been consumed by a hunger for life and would do anything to keep herself from slipping back into that coma. And Sarah, trapped in the abandoned house with the girl, realized that she was in grave danger. Sarah tried to free herself from the girl's grasp, but she was too strong. She dragged Sarah towards the wall and pushed her against it. Sarah's head hit the wall, and she felt a sharp pain in the back of her skull. She tried to scream, but the girl covered her mouth with her hand. The girl whispered, "Don't fight it. You'll see, it's not so bad. It's wonderful to be alive." Sarah struggled, but the girl was too strong. She could feel her consciousness slipping away as the girl's grip tightened. She closed her eyes and prepared for the worst. But then, there was a sudden flash of light, and the girl screamed in pain. Sarah opened her eyes to see a group of police officers storming into the room. The girl released her grip on Sarah and tried to flee, but the police caught her and took her into custody. Sarah was rushed to the hospital, where she was treated for a concussion and several bruises. As she recovered, Sarah learned more about the girl's story. She had been trapped in the abandoned house for years, unable to move or speak. She had been in a coma-like state, aware of everything that was happening around her but unable to communicate. She had somehow managed to reach out to Sarah through her dreams, convincing her to come to the house and free her from her prison. But in the end, it was the police who had rescued her. Sarah never forgot the terrifying experience, but she also never forgot the feeling of being able to help someone in need. She vowed to always be open to the whispers of those in need, no matter how impossible they may seem. There was a small village nestled in the mountains, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. The villagers were simple people, who lived off the land and rarely ventured beyond the safety of their homes. But one day, a group of travelers arrived in the village. They were dressed in strange clothing and spoke a language that no one understood. The villagers were weary of the newcomers, but they welcomed them nonetheless. The travelers seemed friendly at first, but as the days passed, strange things began to happen. Villagers reported seeing shadows moving on their own, and hearing whispers in the dead of night. The travelers always seemed to be nearby whenever these occurrences happened, but they denied any involvement. One night, a young girl disappeared from her home. The villagers searched high and low, but she was nowhere to be found. They questioned the travelers, but they claimed to know nothing. As the days passed, more and more villagers began to disappear. Fear spread throughout the village like a wildfire. The travelers were suspected, but they always seemed to be one step ahead of the villagers. One night, a group of villagers decided to take matters into their own hands. They snuck into the travelers' camp, determined to find evidence of their wrongdoing. What they found was beyond anything they could have imagined. The travelers were not human at all, but a group of shape-shifting creatures who had been preying on the villagers for food. They had been taking the form of the missing villagers to blend in with the community. The villagers fought back, but it was a losing battle. The creatures were too powerful, too fast. The only option left was to flee. As the villagers ran for their lives, they heard a roar coming from the forest. They turned to see a pack of wolves, led by a massive alpha male, charging towards the travelers' camp. The wolves attacked the creatures with ferocity, tearing them apart limb by limb. The villagers watched in awe as the creatures were destroyed, one by one. When the sun rose the next morning, the travelers' camp was nothing but a pile of rubble. The villagers were shaken, but grateful to be alive. They had learned the hard way that not everything is as it seems, and that sometimes, the greatest danger can come from the most unexpected sources. There was a small town on the edge of a dense forest, where the trees were so tall they seemed to touch the sky. The town was quiet and peaceful, but there was a legend that had been passed down from generation to generation. The legend spoke of a mysterious creature that lived in the forest, deep in the heart of the woods. It was said to be a shapeshifter, able to take on any form it wished, and that it could control the minds of those it encountered. For many years, the legend remained just that, a story that parents told their children to keep them from straying too far into the woods. But one day, a group of hikers decided to test the legend and venture into the forest. As they walked deeper into the woods, the trees grew taller and the air grew thicker. Suddenly, they came upon a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a creature unlike anything they had ever seen before. It was tall and slender, with skin as white as snow and eyes that glowed like stars. It looked almost human, but something about it was off. The hikers could feel a strange energy emanating from the creature, as if it were trying to control their minds. They tried to run, but their legs wouldn't move. The creature had taken hold of their minds and wouldn't let go. Days turned into weeks, and the hikers never returned. Their families searched for them, but they were never found. The legend of the creature became more and more terrifying as the years passed, until no one dared venture into the woods again. But one day, a brave young girl decided to face her fears and explore the forest. She had heard the legend of the creature, but she refused to believe it was real. As she walked deeper into the woods, she felt a strange energy in the air. Suddenly, she saw the creature standing before her, its eyes glowing like stars. But instead of feeling fear, she felt a strange sense of calm. The creature spoke to her, telling her that it was not a monster, but a guardian of the forest. It had taken the hikers to protect them from the dangers of the woods, and it had kept them safe. The young girl listened to the creature's words and felt a sense of peace wash over her. She realized that the legend had been wrong all along, and that sometimes, the things we fear the most are not what they seem. In a small village, there lived a young girl named Lily. Lily was a kind-hearted girl, always willing to help those in need. But one day, something strange began to happen. Whenever Lily was around, strange things would occur. Objects would move on their own, doors would slam shut, and shadows seemed to follow her wherever she went. At first, Lily thought it was just her imagination, but soon she realized that something was not right. She tried to ignore it, but the strange occurrences continued to happen. One day, while walking in the forest, Lily came across an old woman who was gathering herbs. The woman looked up at Lily and said, "My dear, you are not like other girls. You have a gift that can be both a blessing and a curse." Lily was confused and asked the woman what she meant. The old woman replied, "You have a gift of magic. You can harness the power of the universe and use it to do good or evil." Lily was frightened by the old woman's words and didn't know what to do. She decided to go to the village elder for guidance. The elder listened to Lily's story and knew what had to be done. She took Lily to a secret chamber deep beneath the village. where she found a book of magic. The elder taught Lily how to harness her powers for good and how to protect herself from those who would try to use the gift for evil. Lily trained for many years, and she became one of the most powerful sorceresses in the land. She used her gift to help those in need and to protect the village from harm. But one day, an evil sorcerer came to the village. He saw Lily's powers and wanted to use them for his own evil deeds. He challenged Lily to a duel, and the two sorcerers battled fiercely. In the end, Lily emerged victorious, but she was gravely injured. The villagers tended to her wounds and nursed her back to health, but she knew that her powers had come with a price. From that day on, Lily knew that a gift of magic was not just a blessing, but also a curse. She used her powers carefully and only when necessary, knowing that the true strength of magic lay in its ability to do both good and evil. There was once a group of friends who loved to explore abandoned places. They would spend hours scouring the internet for information on abandoned buildings and landmarks and then venture out to explore them. One day, they came across an old abandoned hospital. It was said that the hospital had been closed down years ago due to a deadly virus that had broken out, and the entire hospital had been quarantined. The group of friends were intrigued and decided to explore the hospital. As they made their way through the hospital, they found strange symbols etched on the walls and floors, and an eerie silence hung over the entire place. As they explored deeper into the hospital, they heard strange noises coming from one of the rooms. It sounded like someone was crying. The friends cautiously approached the room and found a young girl sitting in the corner, crying. The girl looked up at them and said, "Please, you have to help me. I've been trapped here for years, ever since the virus broke out. I can't leave this place." The friends were shocked and didn't know what to do. They decided to take the girl with them, but as they were leaving, they heard a loud rumbling sound coming from the floor. The floor began to shake, and the walls started to crumble. The friends realized too late that they had disturbed something they shouldn't have, and now they were paying the price. The group of friends were swallowed up by the collapsing hospital, and the young girl's cries echoed through the ruins. But as the dust settled, something strange happened. The young girl disappeared, and in her place, the friends saw the ghostly figures of patients who had died from the virus. The friends realized that they had been lured into a trap, and the young girl was just a decoy. The real trap was the deadly virus that had contaminated the hospital and still lingered in the air. The friends here breathed it in, and now they too were doomed to become ghostly figures haunting the abandoned hospital. There was a small, remote village in the mountains that was rumored to be cursed. The villagers had lived there for generations, and they had always believed that there was a malevolent spirit that haunted their village. One day, a group of young tourists decided to visit the village to see if the rumors were true. They were warned by the locals not to stay too long, but the tourists were curious and wanted to explore the village. As they wandered through the village, they saw strange symbols etched on the walls of the houses, and an eerie silence hung over the entire place. They felt like they were being watched and followed, but every time they turned around, there was no one there. As night fell, the tourists decided to rest in one of the abandoned houses. They built a fire and settled in for the night, but as they slept, they were awoken by strange noises. The tourists saw a figure standing in the shadows, watching them. The figure was tall and thin, with long limbs and a face shrouded in darkness. The tourists were terrified and tried to run, but the figure was too fast. The figure chased them through the village, and the tourists soon realized that they were being herded towards a cave on the outskirts of the village. As they entered the cave, They saw that it was filled with bones and decayed flesh. Suddenly, the figure appeared before them, and the tourists realized too late that they had fallen into the clutches of the cursed spirit that had haunted the village for centuries. The figure revealed that it had been using the rumors to lure people to the village, where it could feed on their fear and devour their souls. The tourists tried to escape, but the cursed spirit was too powerful. One by one, they fell victim to its wrath, and their screams echoed through the mountains. In the end, the cursed village claimed yet another group of unsuspecting victims, and the cursed spirit continued to haunt the mountains for years to come. In a small town, there was an abandoned amusement park that was said to be haunted. The park had been closed for years after a string of accidents that left several people dead. One night, a group of teenagers decided to sneak into the park to explore and see if the rumors were true. They climbed the fence and made their way through the deserted park, marveling at the rusted rides and faded signs. As they wandered through the park, they heard strange noises and saw glimpses of movement out of the corners of their eyes. But every time they turned to look, there was nothing there. The teenagers decided to split up to cover more ground, but soon they realized they were lost and couldn't find their way back to the entrance. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped in the park. As they searched for a way out, they heard a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the park. They followed the sound to the entrance of the old roller coaster, where they saw a figure standing in the shadows. The figure was dressed in a tattered clown suit and had a grotesque mask covering its face. It held a large axe in its hand and started to slowly move towards the teenagers. The teenagers were paralyzed with fear as the figure got closer and closer. They realized too late that they had stumbled upon the ghost of a former clown who had died in an accident on the roller coaster years ago. The ghostly clown lunged at the teenagers with the axe, but they managed to escape by hiding in one of the abandoned rides. As they caught their breath, they realized that they had to find a way out of the park before the ghostly clown found them again. They searched frantically for a way out and finally stumbled upon a hidden exit. They ran as fast as they could, not looking back until they were safely outside the park. The teenagers never spoke of their terrifying encounter again, but they knew that they had come face to face with a vengeful spirit of a haunted amusement park. As the sun set over the abandoned town, a group of teenagers gathered around an old abandoned mansion. They had heard rumors of strange occurrences happening inside, and they wanted to investigate. One of them, a brave girl named Emily, pushed open the creaky door and led the way inside. As they made their way through the dusty rooms, they heard strange noises and felt an eerie presence. Suddenly, Emily's flashlight flickered and went out, leaving them in complete darkness. They heard Emily scream and rushed towards the sound, only to find her lying on the floor, unconscious. They tried to wake her up, but she wouldn't respond. That's when they noticed something strange about Emily's eyes. They were completely white. Suddenly, she sat up and let out a blood-curdling scream, revealing that she was possessed by the evil spirit that had haunted the mansion for years. The group tried to run, but the possessed Emily chased after them, her eyes still glowing white. Just when they thought they were trapped, they heard a voice calling out, "Emily, come back." Emily stopped in her tracks and turned around, her eyes returning to normal. It was her mother, who had come looking for her. She explained that Emily had epilepsy and had a seizure while exploring the mansion. Her eyes turned white due to the seizure, but she was not possessed. The group let out a sigh of relief, but they knew they would never forget the terrifying experience. There was once a small town nestled deep in the woods. where the only way in or out was a narrow dirt road. The townspeople were friendly and welcoming, but visitors were rare, and locals warned outsiders not to venture into the woods at night. One stormy night, a traveler arrived in the town seeking shelter from the rain. The townspeople welcomed him warmly and offered him a place to stay at the local inn. However, as the night wore on, the traveler couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The townspeople seemed to be whispering and glancing at him with suspicion. Unable to sleep, the traveler decided to explore the town. He stumbled upon a small cemetery hidden deep in the woods, and as he walked among the graves, he heard a faint whisper. Startled, he turned around but saw no one. The whisper grew louder, and the traveler realized it was coming from a grave. He approached it, and to his horror, he saw his own name on the tombstone. In that moment, he realized that the town was cursed, and he was doomed to die and be buried in that very spot. The traveler ran back to the inn, but the townspeople had already locked the doors and barred the windows. Trapped, he sat alone in his room, waiting for his inevitable death. As the night wore on, he heard a knock on the door. He cautiously opened it, and to his surprise, he saw a stranger standing outside. The stranger explained that he was a researcher studying the curse that plagued the town, and he had discovered a way to break it. The traveler followed the stranger deep into the woods, where they found an old tree with strange markings on it. The stranger explained that by carving his name into the tree, he could break the curse. The traveler did as he was told, and in a blinding flash of light, the curse was broken. The townspeople, freed from the curse, welcomed him with open arms, and he stayed in the town for several more days before continuing on his journey. However, as he left the town, he realized that the stranger who had saved him had the same name as the tombstone in the cemetery. The traveler realized with a shock that he had been talking to his own ghost, and the curse had never been broken. There was once a small village in the mountains, where the winter snows were so heavy that the village was cut off from the rest of the world for months at a time. The villagers were hardy and self-sufficient, but every winter, strange things began to happen. One winter, a young woman named Maria disappeared from the village. The villagers searched high and low, but they found no trace of her. As the winter wore on, strange rumors began to circulate among the villagers. Some said that Maria had been taken by the spirits that haunted the mountains, while others whispered that she had run away with a lover. But one night, the village was awakened by a blood-curdling scream. The villagers rushed to the source of the noise and found Maria's frozen corpse lying in the snow, her face twisted in terror. The villagers were horrified, and they began to suspect each other. But one villager, a reclusive old man named Nikolai, claimed to have seen the spirits take Maria away. He told the villagers that the spirits were angry with them for neglecting the old ways and had demanded a sacrifice. The villagers were skeptical, but as the winter wore on, they began to experience strange happenings. Food went missing from storage sheds, doors opened and closed on their own, and strange whispers echoed through the night. Desperate to appease the spirits, the villagers decided to offer a sacrifice. They drew lots, and the unlucky villager was sent out into the night as an offering to the spirits. The next morning, the villagers were shocked to find that the sacrifice had worked. The strange happenings had ceased, and the village was at peace. But as spring approached and the snows began to melt, the villagers made a horrifying discovery. The body of the sacrificed villager was found frozen in the snow, his face twisted in terror just like Maria's. The villagers realized with horror that the spirits they had been sacrificing to were not supernatural entities, but something much more human and sinister. And as they looked around at each other, they realized that the real monsters had been living among them all along. There was a small town surrounded by dense forests, and the locals always told stories about strange things that happened in the woods at night. Most people avoided the forest after dark, but a group of teenagers, bored with their mundane lives, decided to explore the woods at night. The group consisted of 4 friends, and they set out into the forest with flashlights in hand. They walked for hours, enjoying the thrill of being out in the wilderness at night. But as they wandered deeper into the woods, they began to feel uneasy. Suddenly, they heard a strange rustling sound coming from the bushes nearby. The friends stopped in their tracks and shone their flashlights in the direction of the noise, but they saw nothing. They shrugged it off and continued walking, but the rustling sounds continued, and the friends began to feel more and more unnerved. As they turned to head back, one of the friends suddenly disappeared without a trace. The others searched for him but found nothing. They called out his name, but he didn't respond. The remaining 3 friends panicked and ran back towards the town, fearing for their lives. When they reached the town, they reported their missing friend to the authorities, who organized a search party. Days turned into weeks, and the search for the missing friend turned up nothing. The 3 friends were traumatized by the experience, and they never spoke of it again. However, years later, one of the friends was out hunting in the forest when he stumbled upon a strange campsite. As he approached the campsite, he saw his missing friend sitting by the campfire, looking older but otherwise unharmed. The friend was overjoyed to see him and asked him what had happened. But the missing friend refused to answer. Instead, he warned his friend never to go into the woods at night again, and then vanished into thin air. The friend returned to the town in shock and told his story to the other 2 friends. They were skeptical but went out to investigate the campsite. When they arrived, they found no evidence of a campsite or any trace of their missing friend. As they walked back towards the town, they noticed strange markings on the trees that seemed to be leading them deeper into the woods. They followed the markings, hoping to find some answers, but they soon realized with horror that the markings were leading them in circles. As they looked around in confusion, they suddenly realized that they were being watched. They shone their flashlights in the direction of the eyes watching them, and to their horror, they saw the missing friend, now much older and with a wild look in his eyes, standing in the shadows. The missing friend smiled a sinister smile and said, "I warned you never to come back into the woods at night." The 3 friends realized with horror that their missing friend had been luring them into the woods all along, and now they were trapped. In a small village nestled in the mountains, there was an old, abandoned mansion that had been left untouched for years. The villagers whispered that the mansion was cursed, and that those who entered would never return. But one day, a group of adventurous teenagers decided to explore the mansion. They broke in through a window and began to explore the dusty, cobwebbed rooms. As they explored the mansion, they heard strange noises coming from the walls, and they saw shadows moving in the corners of their eyes. As they entered the grand ballroom, they saw a beautiful woman dressed in a flowing white gown standing in the center of the room. She was ethereal and seemed to glow in the moonlight. The teenagers were mesmerized by her beauty and approached her, but as they drew closer, they realized that something was off about her. The woman's face was frozen in an eerie, unnatural smile, and her eyes seemed to follow them wherever they went. Suddenly, the woman began to speak, and her voice was cold and hollow. She warned the teenagers that they should leave the mansion at once and never come back. But the teenagers, feeling brave and curious, refused to leave. As they continued to explore the mansion, they began to experience strange things. They heard whispers coming from the walls, felt cold drafts in warm rooms, and saw objects moving on their own. Eventually, the teenagers found a locked door that led to a secret basement. They broke the lock and descended the stairs, but as they entered the basement, they realized with horror that they were not alone. In the dim light, they saw the woman in the white gown standing in the corner of the room. But this time, she was not alone. Dozens of other ghostly figures surrounded her, all staring at the teenagers with empty, soulless eyes. The teenagers tried to run, but the ghosts were too fast. They were surrounded, and the ghosts began to close in on them. Just as the teenagers thought they were about to be consumed by the spirits, the ghosts vanished into thin air. Confused and scared, the teenagers ran out of the mansion and back to the safety of their village. As they ran, they realized with horror that they had made a grave mistake. The mansion was not cursed, and the ghosts were not real. The woman in the white gown was actually a mannequin, and the ghosts were just projections. The teenagers had been lured into the mansion by a group of pranksters who had set up the mannequin and projection system to scare them. But as they looked back at the mansion, they realized that the real horror was not the ghosts, but the human capacity for cruelty and deception. Emily had always been fascinated by the old abandoned house on the edge of town. She had heard stories that it was haunted, but she never believed in ghosts. One night, Emily decided to sneak into the house to explore it. As she walked through the dusty, cobweb-filled rooms, Emily felt a chill run down her spine. The air was heavy, and she felt like she was being watched. She heard strange noises coming from the walls and saw shadows moving in the corners of her eyes. But Emily pushed her fear aside and continued to explore the house. As she entered the attic, she saw an old trunk in the corner. She opened it and found a dusty old book. The book was bound in leather and had strange symbols etched onto the cover. Emily opened the book and began to read. The words were written in a language she didn't understand, but as she read them, she felt a strange energy coursing through her body. Suddenly, the room began to shake, and Emily felt herself being lifted off the ground. When the shaking stopped, Emily found herself in a completely different room. The walls were lined with mirrors, and Emily saw dozens of versions of herself staring back at her. But as she looked closer, she realized that each version of herself was slightly different. In one mirror, her hair was red. In another, her eyes were blue. In another, her skin was covered in tattoos. Emily felt like she was losing her mind, and she tried to leave the room, but the door was locked. Suddenly, she heard a voice behind her. "Welcome to the reflection room," the voice said. "This is where we create your perfect image. You will never leave this room." Emily turned around and saw a figure standing in the shadows. The figure stepped forward, and Emily saw that it was a woman with a scarred face. The woman was holding a knife, and Emily realized with horror that she was the one creating the different versions of Emily. The woman began to walk towards Emily, and Emily knew that she had to escape. She ran towards the mirrors and tried to break them, but they were unbreakable. Emily was trapped, and the woman was getting closer. Just when Emily thought all hope was lost, she felt a strange energy coursing through her body again. This time, she felt a surge of power, and the woman recoiled in fear. Emily realized that the book she had found was a spell book, and she had accidentally cast a spell that gave her supernatural powers. She used her powers to break the mirrors and escape the reflection room. Emily never went back to the old abandoned house again, but she knew that the woman with the scarred face was still out there, creating perfect images of herself and others. Emily knew that she had to use her powers to stop the woman and her twisted game, but she also knew that it would be a dangerous battle. There was a legend in the small town of Willow Creek about a woman who lived alone in a house at the edge of the woods. They said that she was a witch and that she had made a deal with the devil for eternal life. One day, a group of teenagers decided to sneak into the woman's house to see if the legend was true. They climbed through a window and began to explore the house. As they walked through the dark, dusty rooms, they saw strange objects and symbols that they didn't understand. Suddenly, they heard a creaking sound, and they realized that someone was coming. They hid in a closet, but as they waited in silence, they heard a sound of footsteps getting closer and closer. The door to the closet opened, and they saw the woman standing before them. She was old and wrinkled, with piercing green eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. The teenagers were paralyzed with fear, and the woman began to laugh. "You're trespassing in my house," she said, "and now you must pay the price." She pointed a gnarled finger at them, and the teenagers felt a cold energy wash over them. Suddenly, they felt like they were being pulled down, deep into the earth. When they opened their eyes, they were in a dark, damp cave. They tried to stand up, but they realized that they were bound by invisible chains. They looked around and saw that they were surrounded by hundreds of other people, all bound in chains as well. They tried to scream, but their voices were silenced by the woman's magic. The woman appeared before them again, and she began to explain her twisted plan. "I'd have made a deal with the devil," she said, "and in exchange for eternal life, I must sacrifice 100 souls every year. You are now part of my sacrifice." The teenagers realized that they were trapped and that there was no escape. They were doomed to spend eternity in the underground cave, along with the other victims of the witch. But just when all hope seemed lost, one of the teenagers remembered something that his grandmother had told him. She had taught him a spell to break any curse. He closed his eyes and recited the spell, and suddenly, the chains that bound them broke apart. The other victims watched in amazement as the teenagers stood up, free from their prison. They ran towards the exit of the cave, but as they approached the entrance, they saw the woman waiting for them. She was furious, and she began to cast a spell to trap them again. But the teenagers were ready. They had brought a piece of iron with them, which they had learned could break a witch's spell. They threw the iron at the woman, and she screamed in pain. The woman was weakened, and the teenagers were able to escape the cave. They ran back to the town and told everyone what had happened. The legend of the Witch of Willow Creek was never spoken of again, but the teenagers never forgot what they had experienced. They knew that evil was real and that they had the power to fight it. Maggie had always been fascinated by the abandoned mansion at the edge of town. It had been empty for years, and people said that it was haunted. But Maggie didn't believe in ghosts, and she was determined to explore the mansion for herself. One day, she decided to sneak inside the mansion and see what secrets it held. She climbed through a broken window and found herself in a dusty, cobweb-filled room. As she made her way through the mansion, she heard strange noises and whispers coming from the walls. But she ignored them, thinking that it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. As she entered a room with a large mirror, she saw a reflection of herself that was different from her own. The reflection had dark circles under its eyes, and its skin was as pale as snow. Maggie tried to look away, but she couldn't. The reflection began to move on its own, and it stepped out of the mirror and into the room. Maggie was frozen in fear as the reflection approached her. It reached out and touched her, and Maggie felt a cold energy wash over her. Suddenly, she was no longer in the mansion. She was in a dark, misty forest, and she realized that she had been transported to another world. She heard a voice behind her, and she turned to see a dark figure looming over her. The figure had horns and a long, sharp tail, and Maggie knew that it was a demon. The demon spoke to her, promising her power and riches beyond her wildest dreams if she would do its bidding. Maggie was tempted, but she knew that making a deal with a demon was dangerous. She refused the demon's offer, and it disappeared into the shadows. But Maggie was not alone. She realized that there were other people in the forest, all of them trapped in the demon's realm. She knew that she had to find a way out, but she didn't know how. She wandered through the forest, for what felt like hours, until she saw a glimmer of light in the distance. She ran towards it, hoping that it was a way out. As she got closer, she saw that it was a small cottage, nestled in a clearing. Maggie knocked on the door, and an old woman answered. The woman listened to Maggie's story and told her that she knew a way out of the demon's realm. She gave Maggie a vial of potion and told her to drink it when she was ready to leave. Maggie thanked the woman and drank the potion. Suddenly, she felt a rush of energy, and she was transported back to the mansion. She ran out of the mansion and never looked back. From that day on, Maggie knew that there were things in this world that were beyond her understanding. She had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death, and she vowed to never take risks like that again. Emma had always been afraid of the dark. As a child, she would hide under the covers whenever the lights went out, convinced that there were monsters lurking in the shadows. But as she grew older, Emma learned to control her fear. She bought a nightlight and made sure to leave the bathroom light on before going to bed. One night, Emma woke up to find that her nightlight had gone out. She tried to turn on the lamp on her nightstand, but it wouldn't turn on either. Emma began to panic. She was surrounded by darkness, and she could feel a familiar sense of terror creeping up inside her. But then, she heard a sound coming from her closet. It was a soft scratching noise, like something was trying to claw its way out. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she got out of bed and approached the closet. She opened the door slowly, bracing herself for what she might find. Inside the closet, she saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at her. They were red and angry, and Emma knew that they belonged to something that was not of this world. The creature emerged from the shadows, revealing itself to be a small demon with sharp teeth and long, clawed fingers. Emma was paralyzed with fear as it approached her. But then, something strange happened. The demon spoke to her, in a voice that was surprisingly gentle. "I'm sorry to scare you," the demon said. "I know that I look scary, but I'm just a lost soul looking for a way back to my world." Emma didn't know what to make of this. She had always believed that demons were evil creatures, meant to torment and harm humans. But as she looked into the demon's eyes, she saw something that she had never expected to see, a sense of sadness and loneliness that mirrored her own. The demon continued speaking to her, telling her about its life and how it had ended up in her world. Emma listened, and she found herself feeling empathy for the creature. And then, the demon asked her for a favor. It asked her to help it find a way back to its world, so that it could be reunited with its family. Emma hesitated, unsure of what to do. She had always been taught to fear demons, but now she saw that they were not all alike. In the end, she made a decision. She took the demon's hand and promised to help it find a way back to its world. Together, they set out on a journey, navigating the dark and dangerous world that lay beyond Emma's bedroom. And in the end, they succeeded. The demon found its way back to its world, and Emma learned a valuable lesson about the power of empathy and understanding. But even as she lay back in bed, safe and sound, Emma knew that she would never forget the strange and terrifying experience that had changed her life forever. Caroline had always loved exploring abandoned places. She loved the thrill of discovering hidden corners and forgotten treasures, and she loved the feeling of being somewhere that no one else had been in a long time. So when she heard about an old asylum on the outskirts of town, she knew that she had to check it out. Caroline drove out to the asylum one night, and with her flashlight and her camera, She slipped through the chain-link fence that surrounded the property and made her way inside. The asylum was dark and eerie, and Caroline felt a sense of foreboding as she made her way down the hallways. She heard strange noises and saw strange shadows, but she shut them off and kept going. Finally, she came to a door that was locked. Caroline tried to pick the lock, but it wouldn't budge. She was about to give up and leave when she heard a voice coming from the other side of the door. "Help me," the voice said. "Please, I need your help." Caroline was startled. She had been alone in the asylum, and she hadn't heard anyone else enter. But now she could hear the voice, clear as day. She hesitated for a moment, then decided to try and break down the door. She backed up and ran at it, throwing her weight against it. The door gave way with a loud crash, and Caroline stumbled into the room beyond. She saw a figure in the corner, huddled in the darkness. "Are you okay?" Caroline asked. The figure looked up, and Caroline saw that it was a young woman, dressed in a hospital gown. The woman's eyes were wide with fear, and she looked as though she had been through hell. "They are coming for me," the woman said. "Please, you have to help me." Caroline didn't know what to do. She had never been in a situation like this before, and she didn't want to leave the woman behind. She took the woman's hand and started to lead her out of the room. But as they walked down the hallway, Caroline realized that something was wrong. The asylum was no longer silent and deserted. She heard a sound of footsteps coming from behind her, and she felt a cold breeze on the back of her neck. Caroline turned around and saw a group of men in white coats, their faces twisted with anger and hate. They were coming for the young woman, and they weren't going to let her go without a fight. Caroline realized too late that she had made a terrible mistake. She had broken into an asylum that was still in use, and she had put herself and the young woman in danger. As the men closed in, Caroline felt a wave of panic wash over her. She tried to fight back, but it was no use. They overpowered her and took the young woman away, leaving Caroline alone. As Sarah lay in her bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. She tried to ignore it, but the feeling only grew stronger with each passing moment. Suddenly, she heard a creaking sound coming from the closet. Her heart pounding, she got out of bed and slowly approached the closet door. With trembling hands, she opened the door, and to her horror, she saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at her. She screamed and ran out of the room, but the eyes followed her, always watching, always waiting. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah couldn't escape a feeling that she was being watched. She tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, but the eyes were always there, watching, waiting. Finally, unable to take it anymore, Sarah decided to confront her fear head-on. She walked back into her room and stood in front of the closet door. Taking a deep breath, she opened it once again. But this time, there was nothing there. No glowing eyes, no monster, no creature. Just an empty closet. Confused and relieved, Sarah breathed a sigh of relief and turned to leave. But as she did, she saw a small note on the floor. Picking it up, she read the words written on it in shaky handwriting. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to scare you. I just wanted someone to talk to." Shocked and touched, Sarah realized that the eyes she had been seeing were those of a lonely ghost who just wanted a friend. From that day forward, Sarah and the ghost became close friends, and she was never afraid again. As Emily walked home from work, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following her. Every time she turned around, she saw no one, but the feeling persisted. Finally, she made it to her apartment and breathed a sigh of relief as she locked the door behind her. But as she turned to head to her bedroom, she saw a figure standing in the corner of her living room. It was a dark, shadowy figure with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through her soul. Emily froze, unable to move or scream. Suddenly, the figure spoke. "Don't be afraid," it said. "I'm not here to harm you. I'm here to warn you." Emily didn't know what to make of this. "Warn me about what?" she asked. The figure moved closer. "Your ex-boyfriend," it said. "He's coming for you. You need to leave this place and never come back." Emily was shocked. She had broken up with her ex months ago and hadn't heard from him since. But as she looked closer at the figure, she saw that it was wearing her ex's old jacket. Realizing the danger she was in, Emily quickly packed her things and left her apartment. As she walked away, she couldn't help but wonder what other secrets her ex had been keeping from her. Lucas had always been fascinated by the abandoned asylum on the edge of town. He had heard all the stories about the horrors that had taken place there, and he longed to explore the decaying halls and uncover the secrets hidden within its walls. One night, he decided to take matters into his own hands. He snuck into the asylum through a broken window, his heart pounding with excitement and fear. As he wandered through the dark and twisted corridors, he heard strange noises and saw eerie shadows moving in the corners of his vision. He felt as though he was being watched by unseen eyes, and he knew that he was not alone in the asylum. Finally, he came to a room where the door was locked. He jiggled the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Frustrated, he turned to leave, but he heard a strange whispering coming from the other side of the door. Intrigued, he leaned in closer to listen. The whispers grew louder and more insistent, until suddenly, the door swung open. Lucas was sucked into the room by an unseen force, and the door slammed shut behind him. He was plunged into darkness, and he felt cold fingers wrap around his neck. Panic set in as he struggled to break free, but the grip around his neck only tightened. The whispers grew louder and more menacing, until they formed a coherent sentence. "You should not have come here, Lucas. Now you will never leave." With a final gasp for air, Lucas's lifeless body fell to the ground. The asylum had claimed another victim, and his spirit would join the countless others trapped within its walls for all eternity. Sarah was a college student who had just moved into a new apartment in the city. It was an old building with creaky floors and dimly lit hallways, but she loved the charm of the place. One night, Sarah was awoken by a strange noise coming from the hallway. It sounded like footsteps, but she knew that no one else should be in the building at that hour. She got out of bed and cautiously made her way to the door, peering through the peephole to see if anyone was there. But all she could see was darkness. Feeling uneasy, Sarah went back to bed, but the noise continued. It sounded like someone was walking back and forth in the hallway outside her apartment. Suddenly, the doorknob started to turn. Sarah froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that she had locked the door, but someone or something was trying to get in. The door slowly opened, revealing a figure standing in the shadows. It was a tall, dark figure, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. Sarah tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure stepped into her apartment, and she could feel its cold breath on her face. But just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into thin air, leaving Sarah alone in her apartment. Terrified, Sarah called the police, but they found no evidence of anyone breaking in or even being in the building at that time. The experience left Sarah shaken, and she could never explain what had happened that night. Years later, Sarah learned the dark history of her apartment building. It was built on the site of an old cemetery, and many people believe that the restless spirits of the dead still roam the halls. Sarah realized that the figure she had seen that night was likely a ghost, and she was grateful that it had only been a fleeting encounter. It was a cold, dark night in the middle of winter. Jane and her friends were driving back from a party in the countryside when their car suddenly broke down on a deserted road. As they got out of the car to assess the damage, they noticed a large, abandoned mansion in the distance. Hoping to find help, they decided to make their way over to the mansion. But as they approached the house, they could feel an eerie presence, and the feeling of dread grew stronger with every step they took. The mansion was old and decrepit, with vines crawling up the walls and windows boarded up. As they pushed open the front door, they were hit by a musty smell, and the sound of creaking floorboards echoed through the empty halls. They searched the house for any signs of life, but found nothing but dusty furniture and old cobwebs. Suddenly, they heard a faint whisper, and turned to see a ghostly figure standing before them. Its eyes glowed a bright red, and its face twisted into a menacing smile. The figure started to move towards them, and they realized with horror that they were not alone in the mansion. They tried to run, but the doors and windows had all been boarded shut, trapping them inside. The ghostly figure continued to advance, and the friends could feel its icy breath on their faces. They huddled together in fear, waiting for the end to come. But just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into thin air, leaving the friends alone in the mansion. They managed to break down a boarded window and escaped, running to the nearest police station. They reported the incident, but when the police arrived at the mansion, there was no sign of anyone or anything inside. The friends never spoke of that night again, but they could never forget the terrifying experience they had in the abandoned mansion. Sarah had just moved into a new apartment, excited to start her life in the big city. But as soon as she started to settle in, strange things began to happen. At first, it was small things like objects moving on their own, doors creaking shut, and strange whispers in the middle of the night. But as time went on, the activity in her apartment grew more and more intense. One night, Sarah woke up to the sound of scratching coming from her bedroom closet. She got out of bed and cautiously approached the closet door, her heart racing with fear. As she opened the door, she was greeted by a pair of glowing eyes staring back at her from the darkness. She could hear the faint sound of breathing, and the scratching grew louder and more frantic. She slammed the closet door shut and tried to catch her breath. As she sat there, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. The next day, Sarah decided to call in a paranormal investigator to help her figure out what was happening in her apartment. The investigator arrived and set up his equipment, and they began to explore the apartment together. As they entered the bedroom, they noticed that the closet door was slightly ajar. They cautiously approached the door, and as they opened it, they found themselves face to face with a demon. The demon lunged at them, and they ran for the front door, narrowly escaping with their lives. Sarah never returned to that apartment, but she could never forget the terror she had experienced at the hands of the demon that had possessed her home. Mark had always been fascinated by abandoned places, so when he heard about an old, decrepit mansion just outside of town, he knew he had to explore it. He convinced his friends to come along, and they set out on a mission to uncover the secrets of the mansion. As they approached the mansion, they noticed that the door was slightly ajar. They cautiously entered the building, their hearts racing with anticipation. They explored the main floor, but found nothing of interest, so they decided to venture upstairs. As they climbed the stairs, they heard strange whispers coming from the darkness. The whispers grew louder and more intense, and soon they could hear a voice calling out to them. "Get out! The voice said, "Get out before it's too late." But they were determined to press on. They continued up the stairs until they reached the top floor, where they found a locked door. Mark pulled out his trusty lock-picking kit and managed to unlock the door, revealing a hidden room. Inside the room, they found an old book on a pedestal. The book was covered in strange symbols, and they could feel an eerie energy emanating from it. Mark picked up the book and began to read the incantations, not realizing the danger he was putting himself and his friends in. As he finished the final incantation, the room began to shake, and a portal to another dimension opened up in front of them. Out of the portal stepped a horde of demons, ready to claim their souls. Mark and his friends ran for their lives, but it was too late. The demons caught up with them and dragged them back into the portal, never to be seen again. The mansion stood empty once again, a testament to the dangers of curiosity and the power of the unknown. As a young child, Jamie always felt like she was being watched. She would see shadows move in her peripheral vision and hear whispers in the darkness of the bedroom at night. Her parents tried to assure her that it was just her imagination, but Jamie knew there was something more sinister at play. Years passed and Jamie grew up, but the feeling of being watched never left her. She tried to ignore it, telling herself that it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But one night, she couldn't ignore it anymore. She was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep when she felt a cold breath on her face. She opened her eyes to see a figure standing over her bed, its face shrouded in darkness. Jamie tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure just stood there, watching her. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the figure spoke. Its voice was raspy and cold, sending shivers down Jamie's spine. "I've been watching you for a long time," it said. "You belong to me now." Jamie tried to fight back, but she couldn't move. She was paralyzed with fear as the figure reached out and touched her forehead. She felt a sharp pain and then everything went black. When Jamie woke up, she was lying on the floor of the bedroom. She sat up, rubbing her forehead where the figure had touched her. She looked around, but there was no sign of the figure. Jamie thought she had escaped, but then she noticed something strange. There was a mark on her forehead, a mark that looked like a handprint. It was a mark that would never go away, a mark that would always remind her of the night she was taken by the entity that had been watching her all her life. It was a typical Friday night and a group of friends decided to go on a hiking trip to a nearby forest. The forest was known to be a popular spot for campers and hikers, but the locals always warned them to avoid it at night. The group of friends, however, brushed off the warnings and continued on their journey. As they made their way deeper into the forest, they noticed that the trees were becoming denser and the air around them grew colder. Suddenly, one of them pointed to a dilapidated cabin in the distance. The cabin was old and run down, with vines and weeds growing all around it. It looked abandoned, but as they got closer, they noticed that the front door was slightly ajar. They cautiously made their way inside and found themselves in a dimly lit room. The walls were covered in cobwebs and dust, and the furniture was old and worn out. As they explored the cabin, they heard strange noises coming from upstairs. One of them suggested that they leave, but the others were curious and decided to investigate further. As they climbed the stairs, the noises grew louder and more unsettling. When they reached the top, they found themselves in a room with a single chair facing a small television set. The television was flickering, and the screen showed nothing but static. Suddenly, the chair slowly turned around, and they saw an old man with hollow eyes staring back at them. He had a crazed look on his face and his mouth was twisted into a sinister grin. "Welcome," he said in a raspy voice. I've been waiting for you." The friends were frozen in fear as the old man stood up and began to approach them. Just as they thought they were trapped, the door to the cabin burst open and a group of police officers stormed in, guns drawn. The old man was arrested, and the group of friends were shocked to learn that he was a notorious serial killer who had been on the run for years. He had been using the cabin as his hideout and had been luring hikers and campers there to kill them. As the friends made their way back home, they realized just how close they had come to becoming the old man's victims. They never again ignored the warnings of the locals and vowed to always stay vigilant during their outdoor adventures. It was a stormy night, and the power had gone out in the small town. Sarah, a young woman who lived alone in a small house at the edge of town, lit some candles and tried to make herself comfortable. As the storm raged on, she heard a knock at the door. She hesitated at first, but then decided to see who it was. When she opened the door, she saw a man standing outside, drenched from the rain. He asked to come in, saying he needed to use the phone to call for help. Sarah hesitated, but eventually let him in. As the man made the call, Sarah noticed something odd about him. He seemed to be staring at her intently, almost as if he was studying her. She tried to ignore it, but the feeling persisted. After he made the call, the man thanked Sarah and asked to use the bathroom to dry off. As he went upstairs, Sarah heard strange noises coming from the bathroom. She tried to ignore them, but they only grew louder and more disturbing. Suddenly, the noises stopped, and the man came back downstairs. As he made his way to the door, Sarah noticed something strange on his back. It looked like something was moving under his skin. She screamed and tried to run, but the man was too quick. He grabbed her and dragged her into the darkness. The next morning, the storm had passed, and the power was back on in the town. But Sarah was nowhere to be found. The only thing left behind was a small, strange-looking creature, crawling out of a hole in the ground. Samantha had just moved into a new house, and she couldn't wait to make it feel like home. However, she quickly realized that something was not quite right about the place. At first, it was small things, a door that would creak open on its own, a sudden chill in the air. But then, things started to escalate. Objects would move around on their own, and she could hear strange whispers in the dead of night. One night, she woke up to find a figure standing at the foot of her bed. It was a tall, dark figure with glowing eyes, and it seemed to be staring right at her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure just stood there, unmoving, until finally, it vanished into thin air. From that night on, Samantha knew that she was not alone in her house. She began to do some research and discovered that her house had a dark past. It had been built on the site of an old cemetery, and the spirits of the dead were said to still roam the area. Samantha knew that she had to do something to rid her house of the spirits that were haunting her. She contacted a local psychic who claimed to have experience in dealing with restless spirits. The psychic came to Samantha's house and performed a ritual to cleanse the area. As she did so, the spirits became more agitated, and the house shook with their anger. But finally, after hours of chanting and incantations, the psychic declared that the spirits had been banished. Samantha breathed a sigh of relief and finally felt at peace in her new home. That is, until the next night, when she woke up to find the figure at the foot of her bed once again. This time, it spoke to her in a low, menacing voice. "You thought you could banish us? You thought you could get rid of us that easily? We will never leave this place. We are here to stay, and you will never be rid of us." Samantha knew then that she was doomed to spend the rest of her life in that haunted house, trapped with the spirits of the dead. Jenna and her friends decided to spend their summer break camping in the woods. They found a remote spot deep in the forest, and set up their tents for a few days of adventure and fun. On the first night, they built a campfire and shared stories late into the night. But as the night wore on, they began to hear strange noises coming from the woods. It sounded like footsteps, and the rustling of leaves. They tried to brush it off as just their imagination, but the noises grew louder and more persistent as the night went on. Finally, Jenna decided to investigate. She grabbed her flashlight and ventured into the woods, her heart pounding with fear. As she moved deeper into the forest, the noises grew louder, until she could hear them just ahead of her. She shone her flashlight on the source of the noise, and was shocked to see a figure standing just a few feet away. It was tall and dark, with glowing eyes that seemed to stare right through her. Jenna froze in terror, unable to move or scream. The figure began to move toward her, and she could see that it was not human. Its body was twisted and contorted, with razor-sharp claws and jagged teeth. Just as it was about to pounce on her, Jenna woke up in her tent, drenched in sweat. She tried to convince herself that it was just a nightmare, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her from the darkness outside. The next day, the group packed up their camp and headed back to civilization. But as they were leaving, Jenna saw something that made her blood run cold. A pair of glowing eyes, just like the ones from her nightmare, were staring at her from the shadows of the trees. She knew then that the nightmare was not over, and that the creature from the woods would haunt her for the rest of her life. Sarah had always been fascinated by the abandoned house on the edge of town. It was rumored to be haunted, and locals told stories of strange noises, ghostly apparitions, and mysterious disappearances. One night, Sarah decided to explore the house with a group of her friends. They entered through a broken window, and began to explore the dark, dusty interior. As they moved deeper into the house, they heard strange noises coming from upstairs. It sounded like someone or something was moving around, and Sarah's heart began to race with fear. Suddenly, they heard a blood-curdling scream from upstairs, followed by a thud. Sarah and her friends raced up the stairs, and found one of their group lying unconscious on the floor. As they tried to revive their friend, they heard footsteps coming from down the hall. Sarah's friends ran for the exit, but Sarah was frozen with fear. She could feel something watching her from the darkness, and she knew that she was not alone. Just as she turned to run, she felt a cold hand grab her shoulder. She turned around to face the source of the terror, and saw a ghostly figure staring back at her. The figure was pale and translucent, with empty eye sockets and a gaping mouth that seemed to be screaming silently. Sarah tried to run, but the ghostly figure held her fast, its cold grip sending shivers down her spine. Just as she thought all was lost, the figure suddenly vanished, leaving Sarah alone in the darkness. She stumbled out of the house and into the night, never to return again. Years later, Sarah still had nightmares about the haunted house and the ghostly figure that had haunted her that fateful night. She never forgot the terror she felt, and she knew that the abandoned house would forever be a place of fear and dread. Mia and her friends were excited to spend the night in a supposedly haunted hotel. The old building had a long and dark history, and was said to be home to the ghosts of several former guests who had met a grisly end within its walls. As they settled into their room, Mia's friend, Sophia, started to feel uneasy. She felt like something was watching her from the shadows, and she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over her. The others tried to reassure Sophia that it was just her imagination, but as the night wore on, they all began to feel a sense of unease. Suddenly, they heard a loud banging on their door. Mia went to investigate, but found no one there. As she turned to go back to her friends, she saw a figure lurking in the shadows of the hallway. The figure was tall and dark, with glowing red eyes that seemed to pierce her soul. Mia tried to run, but the figure was too fast, and soon caught up to her. Just as she thought it was all over, the figure suddenly vanished into thin air, leaving Mia alone in the dark hallway. The next morning, the group tried to shake off the terror of the previous night, but they couldn't ignore the feeling that they were being watched. As they packed up their things to leave, they discovered something that sent shivers down their spines. On the mirror in their room, someone had written the words "You will never leave" in what appeared to be blood. Mia and her friends ran out of the hotel as fast as they could, never looking back. They knew that they had come face to face with the supernatural, and that they had been lucky to make it out alive. Olivia had always been fascinated by the abandoned mental hospital on the outskirts of town. The crumbling buildings and overgrown grounds held a dark history, and she couldn't resist the urge to explore. One night, Olivia and her friends snuck into the hospital through a broken window. As they made their way through the maze of corridors and rooms, they heard strange noises coming from the darkness. Suddenly, they heard a blood-curdling scream from down the hall, followed by the sound of shuffling footsteps. Olivia and her friends froze in terror as they saw a figure emerging from the shadows. The figure was hunched over, with twisted limbs and a pale, contorted face. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and its skin was slick with a dark, oozing liquid. Olivia and her friends tried to run, but the figure was too fast. It pursued them through the halls, its twisted body contorting in impossible ways as it closed in on them. Just as they thought it was all over, the figure suddenly vanished into thin air, leaving Olivia and her friends alone in the darkness. As they stumbled out of the hospital, Olivia and her friends knew that they had witnessed something truly terrifying. They would never forget the twisted figure that had haunted them that fateful night, and they knew that the abandoned hospital would forever be a place of fear and dread. Lena had always been afraid of the dark, so when the power went out during a thunderstorm, she was paralyzed with fear. She sat huddled in her bed, clutching her blanket and listening to the rain pounding against the windows. As she sat in the darkness, Lena heard a strange scratching noise coming from outside her window. At first, she thought it was just a tree branch tapping against the glass, but the sound grew louder and more persistent. Trembling with fear, Lena slowly made her way to the window and peered outside. She saw a figure lurking in the shadows, its eyes glowing in the darkness. Suddenly, the figure began to scratch at the glass with long, twisted claws. Lena screamed and backed away, but the scratching only grew louder and more frenzied. Just as she thought the window was going to shatter, the scratching stopped. Lena slowly approached the window again, but this time, she saw something even more terrifying. The figure had vanished, leaving behind only a message etched into the glass with its claws. It read, "I see you." Lena spent the rest of the night huddled under her blankets, too afraid to move. She knew that she had come face to face with a supernatural presence, and that it would haunt her dreams for years to come. Rachel had always been fascinated by the abandoned mansion on the edge of town. The sprawling estate had once belonged to a wealthy family, but now it stood empty, shrouded in mystery and rumors of a dark past. One night, Rachel and her friends decided to explore the mansion. As they crept through the dusty rooms, they felt the weight of the mansion's history pressing down on them. As they made their way up to the third floor, Rachel suddenly felt a cold hand grip at her shoulder. She turned around, but no one was there. Suddenly, a voice whispered in her ear, "Get out." Rachel screamed and ran back down the stairs, her friends following close behind. But as they reached the front door, they found that it was locked. They were trapped inside the mansion, with no way out. As they frantically searched for an escape route, they heard footsteps coming from the darkness. The sound grew louder and more persistent, until they saw a figure emerging from the shadows. The figure was cloaked in darkness, with glowing red eyes and razor-sharp claws. Rachel and her friends tried to run, but the figure was too fast. It chased them through the mansion, its claws slashing at their backs. Just as they thought it was all over, the figure suddenly vanished, leaving Rachel and her friends alone in the darkness. As they stumbled out of the mansion, Rachel and her friends knew that they had witnessed something truly terrifying. They would never forget the cloaked figure that had haunted them that fateful night, and they knew that the abandoned mansion would forever be a place of fear and dread. Jenny had always been an avid hiker, and she loved nothing more than exploring the dense forests near her home. But on one particular hike, she stumbled upon something that she never could have prepared for. As she made her way down a narrow trail, Jenny heard a strange rustling sound coming from the bushes. She paused for a moment, but then continued on, thinking it was just an animal. But the rustling grew louder and more persistent, until suddenly, a hand reached out from the bushes and grabbed her ankle. Jenny screamed and tried to pull away, but the hand held her fast. As she struggled to break free, Jenny saw a figure emerging from the bushes. It was a woman, with wild hair and a ragged dress. Her eyes were empty and hollow, and her skin was pale and grey. The woman pulled Jenny closer and whispered, "You don't belong here. Leave this place, or suffer the consequences." Jenny managed to break free and ran back down the trail, her heart pounding in her chest. But as she looked back, she saw the woman disappearing into the shadows. Jenny knew that she had witnessed something truly terrifying, and she never hiked in those woods again. She wondered what would have happened if she hadn't managed to escape, and she knew that the woman in the woods would haunt her dreams for years to come. Carla and her friends had always been fascinated by the old abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town. The building had been closed for years, and rumors of strange occurrences and ghostly sightings had made it a local legend. One night, Carla and her friends decided to explore the hospital. As they made their way through the dimly lit corridors, they felt the weight of the building's history bearing down on them. As they reached the third floor, they suddenly heard a blood-curdling scream coming from down the hall. They cautiously made their way towards the source of the sound, but as they turned the corner, they saw something that made their blood run cold. A ghostly figure was hovering in the air, its body translucent and glowing with an eerie light. It had a twisted, contorted face, and its eyes were filled with an otherworldly rage. As Carla and her friends stood frozen in fear, the figure suddenly lunged towards them, its ghostly arms outstretched. They ran for their lives, but the figure pursued them relentlessly, its ghastly laughter echoing through the halls. As they stumbled out of the hospital, Carla and her friends knew that they had witnessed something truly terrifying. They would never forget the ghostly figure that had haunted them that night, and they knew that the abandoned hospital would forever be a place of fear and dread. Martha had always loved her little cabin in the woods. It was her own personal paradise, away from the stresses of city life. But one night, everything changed. As Martha settled into bed, she heard a strange scratching sound coming from outside. She got up to investigate, but when she looked out the window, she saw nothing but darkness. As she got back into bed, the scratching grew louder and more persistent. It sounded like it was coming from right outside her door. Martha hesitantly opened the door, but she saw nothing in the dim light. She closed the door and got back into bed, but the scratching continued. As the night wore on, the scratching turned into pounding, and Martha realized that something was trying to break into her cabin. She tried to call for help, but her phone was dead and the nearest neighbor was miles away. In a panic, Martha barricaded herself in her bedroom and waited for dawn. But when the first light of morning broke through the window, Martha saw something that chilled her to the bone. Scratched into the wood of her front door was a message, "I will always be watching." Martha knew that she was never truly alone in her cabin, and the thought of what might be lurking in the woods outside would haunt her for the rest of her days.